Tonight's episode, That Was No Lady.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you live. Give me some feedback if you're live or if you're watching this live so that I know where the microphone is working. I think I have it to where it's picking up the microphone better, but I'd like some feedback as we get going here. So we're going to be reading the definition of frame or receiver and identification of firearms proposal from the ATF this morning. I had intended to go through the 34 pages printed, and audio is good. Thank you to Kingpin, who's a good dude out there. Thank you for that. And welcome to whoever this is. So I printed out the 34 pages, and I intended to go through and kind of cross out the extraneous stuff, the things that are basically links or footnotes, things like that, and I wasn't able to do that. I ended up doing some way more awesome stuff last night, so I didn't get that homework done. So I'm going to consider this my first reading, and if it turns into a mess, we'll do this again. But the goal here is to keep people aware of what's going on, and for the people who aren't able or willing to read the thing, then this is just a way to hear the thing. And what we're talking about is about 34 pages printed of proposed rule changes that the ATF has a comment period open for, and these pertain to the redefinition of firearms, but they're calling it definition of firearms or receiver and identification of firearms. All right, so there's a comment period that's open. We've talked about this in other chats, so I'll let you refer to those for the details. We're 6 days into a 90-day comment period, and since we're at the beginning of it, I figure this is a time to offer this piece of resource for anybody that might want it. Looks like there's been 30,000 comments received on this in the last 6 days, so 5,000 a day on average, if you do the math. And that brings us to 7,850 have been approved of that 3,000. I think it was at 6,007 last night or yesterday when we did the kind of reading through the comments. Today, though, is going to be the first attempt to read through the actual document. And what I'll do is, since we're screen sharing here, is I'm going to zoom in on my browser. I don't use Chrome. I use the, whatever this one's called. And I'm going to zoom in so that we can all see it and I don't have to squint. And I'll do my best again to skip over the extraneous pieces of just document like boilerplate. All right, and this is a live conversation. I do these live as opposed to scripted because live is real. And I have the comments going on over here because the people that show up to these chats typically are interested in what we're doing. So feel free to be part of this experience, and feel free to comment and make your commentary. I'm going to attempt to offer no commentary on this read through so that it is just a read through. And I'm about the 5-minute mark, so I'll probably put a timestamp in the description of this video so that people can jump straight to the actual reading and skip past all that introduction. So without any further whatever, let's also remember that this is being a burden placed on us by the government. Nobody wanted to do this. Nobody wanted to have to defend liberty. And we're all taking time out of our otherwise interesting lives to focus on this, not just for our own interest, but for the people in the future who hopefully won't have to deal with this if we can deal with it effectively, right? So with that in mind, we're going to read through it unwillingly on a Thursday afternoon for me, well, morning for me. All right, definition of frame or receiver and identification of firearms. This is from regulations.gov. It's document ATF 2021-001. 0001.0001. First document this year, I guess. All right. Action, notice of proposed rulemaking, request for comment, and the summary. The Department of Justice, from now on I'll call it Department, I guess, proposes amending the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, which we'll call the ATF from now on, regulations to provide new regulatory definitions of firearm, frame, or receiver, and frame or receiver because the current regulations fail to capture the full meaning of these terms. The department also proposes amending ATF's definition of firearm and gunsmith to clarify the meaning of those terms, and to provide definitions of such as complete weapon, complete muffler or silencer device, privately made firearm, and readily for purposes of clarity given advancements in firearms technology. Further, the department proposes amendments to ATF regulations on making and record keeping that are necessary to implement these new or amended definitions. I butchered that, so I'm just going to read that same paragraph. I think I'll just start from the beginning because I'm going to timestamp this anyway. So we're starting with regulations.gov. This is ATF 2021-0001, and it's posted on May 20th, and we have a 90-day comment period. This is the body of the document. Action, notice of proposed rulemaking, request for comment, and then the summary. Department of Justice proposes amending Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, which we'll call ATF, regulations to provide new regulatory definitions of firearm, frame or receiver, and frame or receiver, because the current regulations fail to capture the full meaning of these terms. The department also proposes amending ATF's definition of firearm and gunsmith to clarify the meaning of these terms and to provide definitions of such as complete weapon, complete muffler or silencer device, privately made firearm, and readily for purposes of clarity given advancements in firearms technology. Further, the department proposes amendments to ATF's regulations on marking and record keeping that are necessary to implement these new or amended definitions. Next section says dates. Written comments must be postmarked, and electric comments must be submitted on or before August 19th, 2021. Commenters should be aware that the electronic federal docket management system will not accept comments after midnight Eastern time on the last day of the comment period. Addresses. You may submit comments identified by docket number ATF 2021 R-05 by any of the following methods. Federal e-rule portal, which is www.regulations.gov. Follow the instructions for submitting comments. By mail, through Lang, some guy, Office of Regulatory Affairs, Enforcement Programs and Services, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, 99 New York Avenue, Northeast, mail stop 6N-518, Washington, D.C. 20226. Attention, ATF 2021 R-05, or by fax 202-648-9741. Next section is instructions. All submissions received must include the agency name and docket number, ATF 2021 R-05, for this notice of proposed rulemaking. All properly completed comments received will be posted without change to the federal e-rulemaking portal, regulations.gov, including any personal information provided. For detailed instructions on submitting comments and additional information on the rulemaking process, see Public Participation heading of the Supplementary Information section of this document. For further information, contact Andrew Lang, Office of Regulatory Affairs, Enforcement Programs and Services, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, U.S. Department of Justice, 99 New York Avenue, Northeast, mail stop 6N-518, Washington, D.C. 20226, telephone number 202-648-7070. This is not a toll-free number because the government isn't paying for that phone call. Supplementary information. Background. The Attorney General is responsible for enforcing the Gun Control Act of 1968, as amended, and the National Firearms Act of 1934, as amended. This responsibility includes the authority to promulgate regulations, I don't know what that word is, necessary to enforce the provisions of the GCA and NFA. Congress and Attorney General have delegated the responsibility for administrating and enforcing the GCA and NFA to the Director of ATF, subject to the direction of the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General. Accordingly, the Department and ATF have promulgated regulations implementing the GCA and NFA. Prior to passage of the Gun Control Act, the Federal Firearms Act of 1938, the FFA, regulated all firearms parts. The FFA and implementing regulations defined the term firearm to mean any weapon by whatever name known which is designed to expel a projectile or projectiles by the action of an explosive and a firearm muffler or firearm silencer or any parts or parts of such weapon. The Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 repealed the FFA, replacing it with the Gun Control Act. During debate on the Gun Control Act and related bills introduced to address firearms trafficking, Congress recognized that regulation of all firearms parts was impractical. Not commenting, just let that sink in. Senator Dodd explained that the present definition of this term includes any part or parts of a firearm. It has been impracticable to treat each small part of a firearm as if it were a weapon. The revised definition substitutes the words frame or receiver for the words any parts or parts. A firearm is defined by 18 U.S. Code 921, Section A, subsection 3.2, include not only a weapon that is designed to or may readily be converted to expel a projectile, but also the frame or receiver of any such weapon. Because frames or receivers are included in the definition of firearm, any person who engages in the business of manufacturing, importing, dealing in frames or receivers must obtain a license from the ATF. Each licensed manufacturer or importer must identify by means of a serial number engraved or cast on the receiver or frame of the weapon in such manner as the Attorney General shall by regulations prescribe. Each firearm imported or manufactured by such importer or manufacturer. Licensed manufacturers and importers must also maintain permanent records of production or importation, as well as their receipt, sale, or other disposition of firearms, including frames or receivers. A frame or receiver is the primary structural component of a firearm to which the fire control components are attached. While the Gun Control Act does not define the term frame or receiver to implement the statute, the terms firearm, frame or receiver, and frame or receiver were defined in regulation several decades ago as that part of a firearm that provides housing for the hammer, bolt, or breech lock and firing mechanism, and which is usually threaded at its forward portion to receive the barrel. Try not to comment. The intent in promulgating these definitions was to provide guidance as to which portion of a firearm was the frame or receiver for purposes of licensing, serialization, and record keeping, thereby ensuring that a necessary component of the weapon could be traced if later involved in a crime. At the time these definitions were published around 50 years ago, single-framed firearms such as revolvers and break-open shotguns were far more prevalent for civilians than split multi-piece receiver weapons, such as semi-automatic rifles and pistols with detachable magazines. Single-frame firearms incorporate the hammer, bolt, or breech lock and firing mechanism within the same housing. Years after these definitions were published, split multi-piece receiver firearms such as the AR-15 semi-automatic rifle with an upper and lower receiver, the Glock semi-automatic pistols, upper slide assembly and lower grip module, and the SIG P320, adopted by the military with the upper slide assembly, chassis, and lower grip, became popular. Additionally, more firearms manufacturers began incorporating a striker-fired mechanism rather than a hammer in the firing design, With the rise in popularity of striker-fired Glock semi-automatic pistols in the mid-1980s, other manufacturers began incorporating a striker-fire mechanism rather than a hammer in semi-automatic handguns. It's not a comment, it's just a hand face palm. Keep going. So A, the ATF's application of the definitions to split frames or receivers. Although ATF's regulatory definitions of frame or receiver do not expressly capture these types of firearms, example, split multi-piece receivers, that now constitute the majority of firearms in the United States, ATF's position has long been that the weapon should be examined with a view toward determining if the upper or lower half of the receiver more nearly fits the definition of receiver, and more specifically for machine guns, whether the upper and lower portion has the ability to accept machine gun parts. Not commenting. Since it began issuing firearm classifications under the Gun Control Act and National Firearms Act in private letter rulings and for criminal investigations, ATF has considered a variety of factors when examining firearms, including which component the manufacturer intended to be the frame or receiver, which component the firearms industry commonly considers to be frame or receiver with respect to the same or similar firearms, how the component fits with the overall design of the firearm when assembled, the design and function of the fire control components to be housed, such as the hammer, bolt, or breech lock and firing mechanism, whether the component could be permanently, conspicuously, and legibly be identified with a serial number and other markings in a manner not susceptible of being readily obliterated, altered, or removed in accordance with regulations, whether classifying the particular component is consistent with the legislative intent of the Gun Control Act in implementing regulations. Finally, whether classifying the component as a frame or receiver is consistent with the ATF's prior classifications. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 examples. I'm not commenting. Even though neither the upper nor lower portion of the split multi-piece receiver firearm alone falls within the precise wording of the regulatory definition, ATF has for many years interpreted the regulatory definition using these factors as a guide in determining which portion of the weapon model is a firearm, frame, or receiver. Indeed, the current definitions were never intended to be or understood to be exhaustive. At any time the current definitions were adopted, there were numerous models of firearms that did not contain a part that fully met the regulatory definition of frame or receiver, such as the Colt 1911, FNFAL, and the AR-15, all of which were originally manufactured almost exclusively for military use. And the ATF has long applied these factors in determining which component of these weapons qualifies as the frame or receiver. Existing law recognizes that the definition of frame or receiver need not be limited to a strict application of the regulation. The prefatory paragraph to the definitional section of states, when used in this part and in forms prescribed under this part, where not otherwise distinctly expressed or manifestly incompatible with the intent thereof, terms shall have the meanings ascribed in this section. The intent of Congress, as indicated by the plain language and the statutory scheme of the Gun Control Act, is to regulate as a firearm the frame or receiver of a firearm. As stated above, Congress replaced the term part or parts in the FFA definition of firearm with frame or receiver, the major parts of a weapon regulated under the Gun Control Act. This includes marking these parts with serial numbers for tracing purposes, recording these parts as firearms in required records, and running a NICS background check when individuals purchase or acquire them from an FFL. They didn't put that in there, but they're lazy. In the past few years, however, some courts have treated the regulatory definition as exhaustive when applied to the lower portion of the AR-15 rifle, which is the semi-automatic version of the M16 type machine gun, originally designed for the U.S. military. While the ATF for decades has classified the lower receiver of the AR-15 as a frame or receiver, Courts recently have read the regulatory definition to mean that the lower portion of the AR-15 is not a frame or receiver because it only provides housing for the hammer and firing mechanism, but not the bolt or breech lock. Ooh, I think this is referring to something. The language of the regulatory definition in subsections 478.11 lends itself not only to one interpretation, namely that under the Gun Control Act, the receiver of a firearm must be a single unit that holds 3, not 2, components: the hammer, the bolt or breech lock, and the firing mechanism. So that comes from, like, that's citing some precedent, I think. It's hard to say with all this lawyer stuff in here. I think I'm supposed to keep reading. A receiver must have the housing for 3 elements. Oh, these are 3 different things it's citing that cite definitions of a receiver, I think. A receiver must have the housing for 3 elements: hammer, bolt, breech lock, and firing mechanism. And then finally, granting defendants post-trial motion for acquittal for manufacturing AR-15 lower receivers without a license because no reasonable person would understand that a part constitutes a receiver where it lacks the components specified in regulation. I'm not trying to make it difficult. I'm trying to read it here. So the court's interpretation of ATF's regulation, if broadly followed, could mean that as many as 90% of all firearms now in the United States would not have any frame or receiver subject to regulation. I like that. The firearms would include numerous widely available models, such as Glock type and Sig Sauer P230. I'm not trying to comment. Do not utilize a hammer, a named component in the firing sequence. Such a narrow interpretation of what constitutes a frame or receiver would allow persons to avoid A, obtaining a license to engage in the business of manufacturing or importing upper or lower frames or receivers, identifying upper or lower frames or receivers with serial numbers and or traceable markings, maintaining records of upper and lower receivers or upper or lower frames or receivers produced or imported through which they can be traced. And then finally, running NICS checks on potential transferees to determine if they are legally prohibited from receiving or possessing firearms when they acquire upper or lower frames or receivers. In turn, this would allow prohibited persons to acquire upper and lower receivers that can quickly be assembled into semi-automatic weapons more easily and without a background check. Not commenting. If no portion of a split multi-piece frame or receiver were subject to any existing regulations, such as marking, record keeping, or background checks, law enforcement's ability to trace semi-automatic firearms later used in crime would be severely impeded. This result would thereby undermine the intent of Congress in requiring the frame or receiver of every firearm to be identified. I have to take a drink, so I'm about to go to the next section, and I'm taking a drink. I don't know if this is worth reading or not. I'm not going to stop to read comments because I think that messes with the flow, but I had to stop to get some water in my throat. All right, privately made firearms or ghost guns. Technological advances have also made it easier for unlicensed persons to make firearms at home from standalone parts or weapons parts kits by using 3D printers or personally owned or leased equipment. Without any records or a background check. Commonly referred to as ghost guns, these privately made firearms, we're going to call them PMFs, when made for personal use, are not required by the Gun Control Act to have serial numbers placed on the receiver or frame, making it difficult for law enforcement to determine by whom or when they were manufactured and to whom were sold or otherwise disposed. In recent years, the number of PMFs have recovered from crime scenes throughout the current country has increased. From January 1st, 2016 through December 31st, 2020, there were approximately 23,906 suspected PMFs. Personally manufactured firearms are called PMFs by the ATF, reported to the ATF as having been recovered by law enforcement from potential crime scenes, not used in crime, just recovered from crime scenes, including 325 homicides or attempted homicides. They weren't used in those homicides, but they were recovered from the crime scenes of those homicides. They didn't write any of that, but that's the part that they're not trying to say. That were attempted to be traced by the ATF, broken down as by the year. Look at this rate. In 2016, there were a mere 1,700 PMFs. In 2017, the number of PMFs rise to 2,507. In 2018, it didn't go down. Instead, it went up to 3,776 PMFs. In 2019, it more than doubled to 7,161 PMFs, the most it's ever been, until 2020, when it went to 8,721 PMFs in a country, 361 million people. It's amazing how they're even actually able to track that many PMFs in a country that big. I mean, it's almost like they're going beyond the pale to try to keep track of every single thing, right? It is therefore not unexpected that numerous federal criminal, I'm trying not to, that wasn't a comment. I'm not commenting, sorry. It is therefore not unexpected that numerous federal criminal cases have been brought by the department to counter illegal trafficking in unserialized home completed and assembled weapons and possession of such weapons by prohibited persons. All right, I got to read that again because I got in trouble. The commenting got me all off my track here. It is, therefore, not expected that numerous federal criminal cases have been brought by the department to counter illegal trafficking in unserialized home completed and assembled weapons and possession of such weapons by prohibited persons. The problem of untraceable firearms being acquired and used by violent criminals and terrorists is international in scope. On May 28, 2019, citing intelligence reports by the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and National Counterterrorism Center and the House Committee on Homeland Security issued a report concluding that ghost guns not only pose a challenge on the front end, enabling buyers to purchase deadly weapons with just a few clicks like this online, could have bought a deadly weapon, but also on the back end. Hamstringing. I don't even know what that is. I'm not commenting. Law enforcement's ability to investigate crimes committed with untraceable weapons, and that the wide availability of ghost guns and the emergence of functional 3D printed guns are a homeland security threat. Terrorists and other bad actors may seek to exploit the availability of these weapons for dangerous ends. They may do that. It says right in the government. I'm not commenting. Criminal investigations and studies highlight this concern. Well, there you go. The Gun Control Act insists that the dealer keeps certain records to enable federal. I shouldn't talk about this. Is a terrorist going to see this and find out about I'm not commenting. The Gun Control Act insists that the dealer keep certain records to enable federal authorities both to enforce the law's verification measures and to trace firearms used in crimes. They're citing something. That information helps to fight serious crimes. I don't know why that came up in the middle of a bunch of gup. I don't know. This is hard to read. I think ATF has a statutory duty pursuant to the Gun Control Act to trace firearms to keep them out of the hands of criminals. I'm going to read that again because I'm not commenting, but let this sink in. ATF has a statutory duty pursuant to the Gun Control Act to trace firearms to keep them out of the hands of criminals. An accurate firearms description is necessary to trace a firearm and is required to be recorded by a person licensed to engage in the business of manufacturing, importing, or dealing in firearms, or by a licensed collector of curio or relic firearms, regardless of whether it's a business or a personal firearm. ATF traces firearms found by law enforcement at a crime scene by first contacting the licensed manufacturer or importer marked on the frame or receiver who maintains permanent records of their manufacturer or importation and disposition. Using the information obtained from these required records, ATF then contacts each licensed dealer or other licensee who recorded their receipt and disposition to locate the first unlicensed purchaser. That's you people. You people are unlicensed purchasers. I'm not commenting, just letting you people know you're an unlicensed purchaser to help find the perpetrator or otherwise solve the crime. However, because PMFs do not bear serial numbers or markings of licensed manufacturer or importer, ATF has found it extremely difficult to complete such traces on behalf of law enforcement to individual unlicensed purchasers. That's you, people that just buy things without a license. From January 1st, 2016 through March 4th of 2021, not 5th, but the 4th, ATF could not complete traces of suspected PMFs recovered by law enforcement to an individual purchaser in approximately 151 out of those 23,946 attempts. So that's 151 times out of 23,946. I'm not commenting, I just repeated those numbers. Generally, by tracing a serial number engraved on a handgun, slider, blah, blah, hair, barrel, or firearm part, not currently defined as a frame or receiver, but recorded by licensees in the absence of other markings. With the proliferation of PMFs, ATF has also received numerous requests from licensees seeking clarity on how they may be accepted and recorded so that they can track their inventories, process warranty claims, reconcile any missing inventory, respond to trace requests, and report lost or stolen PMFs to police and insurance companies. Federal law and regulations require licensees before conducting business to inventory the firearms possessed for such business and record it in a firearms acquisition and disposition record, an A&D record. After commencing business, licensees must record all firearms received and disposed of by the business in the A&D record to include the following information separated into columns: manufacturer and or importer, model, serial number, type, caliber, or gauge. When a firearm is disposed to an unlicensed person, you people, licenses are required to complete a firearms transaction record, ATF Form 4473. You've heard of that before. Like the A&D record, this form requires licensees to record the manufacturer and importer, model, if designated, serial number, type, and caliber or gauge of the firearm. Licensees are also required by federal law to report the theft, loss, or loss of firearms on a federal firearms licensee's theft or loss report ATF level, which includes a description of the manufacturer, importer, model, serial number, type, caliber, and gauge of each firearm stolen or lost. And when licensees sell or otherwise dispose of multiple pistols or revolvers within 5 consecutive business days to the same person, which is basically an unlicensed purchaser, they must report to the ATF the type, serial number, manufacturer, model, importer, and caliber on a report of multiple sale or other disposition of pistols and revolvers, an ATF Form 3310.4, which you might want to look up. I'm not commenting, but most people don't realize that every time you buy more than 5 handguns within a 5-day period, the FFL is required to fill out that form and report you to the government for buying so many handguns at one time. However, because PMFs do not have markings identifying the name of a licensed manufacturer or importer, model, serial number, or caliber or gauge, licensees might only record a type of firearm, such as pistol, rifle, or shotgun, in their A&D records and on ATF forms. Over time, as more PMFs are accepted into the inventory, it will become increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for licensees and ATF during inspections to distinguish between those PMFs physically in the firearms inventory and those recorded in required A&D records, as well as determine which PMFs recorded as disposed of on the 4473s were those recorded as disposed of in the A&D record. Likewise, it will be difficult for licensees and the ATF to accurately determine which PMFs were stolen from lost inventory and for police to locate stolen PMFs if the business inventory locate them in the business inventories of pawnbrokers, or to return any recovered, stolen, or lost PMFs to their rightful owners. Because we all know that every PMF looks exactly the same. No PMFs have any characteristics that make them individual. I'm not commenting. Not only does the inability to distinguish between unmarked firearms make it extremely difficult for law enforcement to trace PMFs involved in crime, it also makes it more difficult for federal, state, and local law enforcement to identify and prosecute illegal firearms traffickers who are often tied to violent criminals and armed narcotics traffickers. Just saying. The ATF Form 4473 is the primary evidence used to persecute straw purchasers who buy firearms from a federal firearms licensee on behalf of prohibited persons such as felons and other persons who would use them to commit a violent crime. other people that commit violent crimes besides felons. Is that the government? I'm not commenting. The form is typically the key evidence that the straw purchaser who bought the firearm and can pass a background check made a false statement to the FFL concerning the identity of the actual purchaser when acquiring that firearm in violation of the law, but as unmarked and difficult to trace PMFs proliferate throughout the marketplace, it is likely to become increasingly difficult to prove the firearms acquired under false pretenses on Form 4073 were the ones found in the hands of the true purchaser, and thus more difficult to prosecute straw purchasers for making false statements. This assumes, of course, that the PMF involved in the crime would even be traced to the FFL or the correct 4473 could be located. Likewise, the absence of identifying firearm information on multiple sales and theft loss reports makes it more difficult for ATF to identify firearms traffickers and thieves because I'm not commenting, but it's so difficult for the ATF. Although clarifying the definition of frame and or receiver in this rule would help the firearms industry and the public Although clarifying the definition of frame or receiver in this rule would help the firearms industry and the public understand which part of a complete weapon is the regulated frame or receiver, and more commercially manufactured frames or receivers are likely to be marked by licensed manufacturers as a result, PMFs are increasingly being made or 3D printed at home without any identifying marks, record keeping, or background checks. In turn, these firearms are progressively finding their way into licensees who may wish to acquire them so that they can advertise and market them broadly, or who may repair or customize or accept them as a security and a pawn for a loan. Rulemaking is therefore necessary. I'm not glitched. I'm just making that sink in. Rulemaking is therefore necessary to ensure that PMFs are not unlawfully manufactured for sale to licensees who may wish to acquire them for resale or to accept them as security and a pawn for a loan, as this would undermine the important public safety goals of the Gun Control Act to reduce violent crime, which includes assisting state and local law enforcement in their efforts to control traffic of firearms within their borders. Indeed, several states and municipalities have banned or severely restricted unserialized 3D printed firearms. So I'm not commenting, but I'm going to take another drink, because now we're at the section 2 of the whole big thing, proposed rule. And just to let this sink in, this here is how much we've gone over. You see my mouse underneath the little dog over there? This is how much we got left to go. We might be here for a little while. This dude has got a show going in 2 minutes that I'm not going to be able to get to because I'm reading this. So if you're interested, this is a little break. You can go watch Walt get mad at people or say stuff. Let's see. Now we got. Oh, I better mute that. Oh, I can't mute it yet. It's a premiere, so you're not missing nothing live. That's why I figured I would just go, because it's just a premiere. I can watch it later. All right, the proposed rule. This is difficult. If you want a super chat, go for it. I'll take the money. There we go. Due to judicial developments as well as continued technological advancements in firearms manufacturing, maintaining the current definition negatively affects both public safety and the regulated firearms industry. For those reasons, the department proposes amending ATF's regulation to clarify the definition of firearm and to provide a more comprehensive definition of firearm, or definition of frame or receiver, so that those definitions more accurately reflect firearm configurations not explicitly captured under the existing definitions. And further, what is NPRM? I think it's like new rule. I've missed, I'm looking for I don't know where this abbreviation came from. Did I miss it somewhere? Sorry for the pause. I am scrolling back to figure out what NPRM. If somebody knows what NPRM is, tell me. I'm glitching. It's got to be something about the name of this thing, right? New rule, proposed lawmaking or something. But anyway, I guess I'll just go back down. I don't know what I'm abbreviating there, so I don't know what to say. right. So further, this new proposed rulemaking or something proposes, is that what it is? I don't know where it is. Anyway, so, oh, there's Walt. I will mute that and pause it so that it doesn't work our bandwidth. All right. So this NPRM proposes new terms and definitions to take into account technological developments and modern terminology in the firearms industry, as well as amendments to the marking and record-keeping requirements that would be necessary to implement those definitions. However, nothing in this rule would restrict persons not otherwise prohibited from possessing firearms from making their own firearms at home without marking solely for personal use, not for sale or distribution, in accordance with state, federal, and local law. I got the hiccups. I got to drink some water. Hold on. Turns out if you get the hiccups and you keep talking, it doesn't make the hiccups go away. All right. So also, while licensed manufacturers who sell or distribute firearms to law enforcement agencies would be subject to this rule, law enforcement agencies not engaged in the business of manufacturing firearms for sale or distribution would be excluded from this rule, including associated amendments to making and marking and record-keeping requirements necessary to implement its definitions. All right, next up is definition of firearm. Under the Gun Control Act and implementing regulations, the term firearm includes any weapon, including a starter gun, which will or is designed to or may readily be converted to expel a projectile by the action of an explosive. Although weapons parts kits in their unassembled, incomplete, and unfinished state or configuration generally will not expel a projectile by the action of an explosive at the time of sale or distribution, weapons parts kits that are designed to or may readily be converted to expel a projectile by the action of an explosive are firearms under the GCA. In recent years, individuals have been purchasing firearms kits with incomplete frames or receivers, commonly called 80% receivers, either directly from manufacturers of the kits or retailers without background checks or record keeping. Some of these parts kits contain most or all of the components, finished or unfinished, necessary to complete a functional weapon within a short period of time. Some of them include jigs, that's nice. Some of them include jigs, templates, instructions, drill bits, and tools that allow the purchaser to complete the weapon to a functional state with a minimal effort, expertise, or equipment. Weapons parts kits such as these are firearms under the Gun Control Act because they are designed to or may be readily converted to expel a projectile by the action of an explosive. Manufacturers of such parts kits must be licensed, abide by the marking and record-keeping requirements, and pay federal firearms excise tax on their sales price. Any federal, so they're going to pay the tax for a complete firearm on their kits. I'm not commenting them. Any federal firearms licensee that sells such kits to unlicensed individuals, you people, would need to complete ATF forms 4473, conduct NICS background checks, and abide by the record-keeping requirements applicable to fully completed and assembled firearms. Therefore, to reflect existing case law, this proposed rule would add a sentence, add a sentence at the end of the definition of firearm, providing that the term shall include weapons parts kits that are designed to or made readily available to be assembled, completed, or converted to restored to expel a projectile by the action of an explosive. Nonetheless, this amendment is not intended to affect the classification of a weapon, including a weapons parts kit, in which each frame or receiver, as defined by this proposed rule, of such weapon is properly destroyed in accordance with the ATF standards. Because such weapons have been completely destroyed or permanently redesigned to not expel a projectile by the action of an explosive and cannot be readily converted to do so, ATF would not consider them as either designated or designed or readily assembled, completed, or converted, or restored to expel a projectile by the action of an explosive. To make this clear, the proposed rule would add another sentence to the end of the definition of firearm. That's all. The term shall not include a weapon, including a weapon's parts kit, which each part defined as a frame or receiver of such weapon is destroyed. But we're not going to define destroyed. I'm not commenting. Definition of a frame or receiver. The proposed new regulatory definition of frame or receiver would be a multi-part definition. It's fluid. It's a fluid definition. I'm not commenting. First, there would be a general definition of frame or receiver with non-exclusive examples that illustrate the definition. This would be followed by supplements that further explain the meaning of the term frame or receiver for certain firearms designs and configurations as follows. Firearm muffler or silencer, frame or receiver. I'm not commenting, but it makes perfect sense that a firearms receiver is a firearms muffler or a silencer. Makes perfect sense. Split or modular frame or receiver, also followed by examples of the frames or receivers for common firearms designs that are distinguishable because of the differences in firing cycle, method of operation, or physical design characteristics. Partially complete, disassembled, or inoperable frame receivers, destroyed frame receivers, frames or receivers. Although the new definition would more broadly define the term frame or receiver than the current definition, it is not intended to alter any prior determinations by ATF of what it considers the frame or receiver of a particular split modular weapon. ATF would also continue to consider the same factors when classifying firearms. I'm not trying to comment, but I want to smash my face a little. General definition of frame or receiver. So this is different than definition of frame or receiver, which is the first paragraph. Now we're in a paragraph which says general definition of frame or receiver. It's a different paragraph. ATF proposes to replace the respective regulatory definitions of firearm frame or receiver and frame or receiver in 27, because they do too narrowly limit the definition of receiver in respect to most current firearms and have led to erroneous district court decisions. Indeed, most firearms currently in circulation in the United States do not have a specific part that expressly falls within the current frame or receiver regulatory definitions. Most concerning is that the interpretation of these definitions by some courts relying on the current regulations would make it easier to obtain the majority of existing firearms, including some of the most advanced semi-automatic weapons, without complying with the requirements of the Gun Control Act, and make it far more difficult to trace those firearms after a crime, which we all know stops crime. I'm not going to comment though. Should the current definition remain in place and courts continue to interpret it such that no part or parts of most firearms are defined as the frame or receiver, these unserialized parts, easily purchased and assembled to create functioning firearms, would be untraceable, therefore putting the public at risk. While a frame or receiver is clearly within the statutory definition of what constitutes a firearm under the Gun Control Act, clarifying that this term includes how most modern-day firearms operate would help ensure that the regulatory definition of frame or receiver will not be misinterpreted by the courts, the firearms industry, or the public at large to mean that most firearms in circulation have no part identifiable as a frame or receiver, which is what we live in today. As a threshold matter, the new definition makes it clear that a frame or receiver must be visible. I'm not commenting. I can't help what I read, and I couldn't help it. As a threshold matter, I don't know what that means. Does that mean like it's super important? As a threshold matter, the new definition makes it clear that a frame or receiver must be visible to the exterior when the complete weapon is assembled, so that licensees can quickly record the identifying marks and law enforcement officers who recover the weapon can easily see the identifying markings for tracing purposes. Nonetheless, as explained in the preamble, an internal frame or chassis, at least partially exposed to the exterior to allow identification, may be determined by the ATF to be the frame or receiver of a split or modular firearm or receiver. Thank you, ATF, for graciously allowing some of them. I'm not commenting. Next, the new definition more broadly describes a frame or receiver as one that provides housing or a structure designed to hold or integrate any fire control component, Unlike the prior definitions of frame or receiver that were rigidly tied to 3 specific fire control components, i.e. those necessary for the firearm to initiate or complete the firing sequence, the new regulatory definition is intended to be general enough to encompass the changes in technology and parts terminology. With respect to the fire control components housed by the frame or receiver, the definition would include, at a minimum, any housing or holding structure for a hammer, bolt carrier, breech lock, cylinder, trigger mechanism, firing pin, striker, or slide rails. However, the definition is not limited to these particular fire control components. There may be future changes in firearms or terminology resulting in housings or holding structures for new or different components that initiate, complete, or continue the firing sequence of weapons that expel a projectile by the action of an explosive. And what about the children in that case? So for further clarity, the definition would then give 4 non-exclusive examples with illustrations of common single-framed firearms. Hinged or single-frame revolver, bolt-action rifle, break-action, lever-action, or pump-action shotgun, semi-automatic firearm or machine gun with a single housing. I'm not commenting. I'm just going to breathe and keep going. That part's interesting. I would read that in rage. If you are to comment, I would read that part in rage. All right. Finally, the definition would make it clear to persons who may acquire or possess a part now defined as a frame or receiver that is identified with a serial number that they must presume, absent an official determination by the ATF or other reliable evidence to the contrary, that the part is a firearm, frame, or receiver without further guidance. It has to be completely obvious unless the ATF or other reliable evidence to the contrary proves that it isn't. No, it's so clear, so obvious. I'm not commenting though. Section 2, firearms, muffler, or silencer, frame, or receiver. It's totally clear. We understand what this section is going to be about. Firearms, muffler, or silencer, frame, or receiver. No problem. Under the Gun Control Act, licensed manufacturers and importers must identify the frame or receiver of each firearm, including a firearms, muffler, or silencer, with a serial number and a guidance in accordance with regulations. The NFA requires firearms manufacturers, importers, and manufacturers to identify each firearm, including a firearm, muffler, or silencer, with a serial number and such other identification as may be prescribed by regulations. Because under the NFA, each individual part of a firearms, muffler, or silencer is a firearm that must be registered with the National Firearms Transfer Record. The regulations currently assume that every part defined as a silencer must be marked in order to be registered and expressly required that they be marked whenever sold, shipped, or otherwise disposed, even though they may be installed by a qualified licensee, that's not you people, within a complete muffler or silencer device. However, this result has caused confusion and concern among many silencer manufacturers. They're stupid. Because some silencer parts defined as silencers, such as baffles, are difficult to mark, because I'm not commenting, and make little sense to mark for tracing purposes when the outer tube or housing of the complete device is marked and registered. It not only is difficult for manufacturers to apply identifying marks, there's also the administrative difficulty in timely filing and processing numerous ATF Form 2s for each part of a suppressor. Isn't it nice that the ATF is aware that is frustrating? I'm not commenting. For those reasons, ATF is proposing a number of amendments to clarify how and when firearms, muffler, or silencer parts must be marked and registered in the FARTNER. Among other changes, this rule defines the term frame or receiver as it applies to a firearm, muffler, silencer, or frame or receiver, and adds the term complete muffler or silencer device. Oh yeah, now we go. Okay. Under the NPRM, the term frame or receiver means, in the case of a firearms muffler or firearms receiver, a part of the firearm that, when the complete device is assembled, is visible from the exterior and provides housing or a structure such as an outer tube or a modular piece designed to hold or integrate one or more of the essential internal components of the device, including any of the following: baffles, baffle material, expansion chamber. These new definitions would clarify for manufacturers and makers of complete mufflers or silencer devices that they need only mark each part or specific parts previously determined by the director of the device defined as a frame or receiver under this rule. However, the individual muffler silencer parts must be marked if they are disposed of separately from a complete device unless transferred by a qualified manufacturer or other qualified licensees for the manufacturer of complete devices. I can't understand why people don't understand this. They find this confusing. You're dumb if you find this confusing. ATF anticipate, I'm not commenting though, that's just facts. ATF anticipates that under this supplemental definition, the outer tube of a complete muffler or silencer device would be considered the frame or receiver with respect to most commercial silencer device designs currently on the market. This is because the outer tube would be the only housing for the essential internal components of the complete device. Marking the outer tube is distinguished from smaller non-housing component like an end cap that may be damaged upon expulsion of projectiles best preserves the ability of law enforcement to trace the silencer device used in a crime and is consistent with the recommendations ATF has received from the firearms industry. Nonetheless, it is the definition of frame receiver for projectile weapons, like the definition of firearms for projectile weapons. This sub-definition would be flexible enough to encompass changes in technology and parts terminology. This is because any housing or structure designed to hold or integrate essential internal components of the muffler or silencer device would meet the definition. While the proposed definition gives examples of internal components that manufacturers must consider as essential, baffles, baffling material, or expansion chambers, it's not limited to those particular components. So if you start putting resistors and capacitors into your suppressors, those are going to be serialized also. All right, next we're on split or modular frame or receiver. This second supplement explains that the ATF may determine, in the case of a firearm with more than one part that provides housing of a structure designed to hold or integrate one or more of the fire control or essential components, whether one or more of the specific parts of a weapon is the frame or receiver, which may include an internal frame or chassis at least partially exposed to the exterior to allow identification. It then sets forth the factors ATF considers in making this determination, which are which component the manufacturer intended to be the receiver, which component the firearms industry commonly considers to be the frame or receiver with respect to the same or similar firearms, how the component fits within the overall design of the firearm when assembled, the design and function of the fire control components to be housed or integrated, and whether the component may be permanently conspicuously and legibly be identified with a serial number and other markings in a manner not susceptible of being readily obliterated, alterated, or removed. Whether classifying the particular component is consistent with the legislative intent of the Act and this part, and whether classifying the component as a frame or receiver is consistent with the director's prior classifications. Everything has to be with the director's prior classifications. I don't know if that's always been in there, but I'm noticing that. I'm not commenting though. No single factor is controlling. No, of course, you want to have any of these override the others. It should be completely fluid to whatever the individual decides. Who's making the determination on your freedom? It would. I'm not commenting. I'm just giving you some what I think. It would further make it clear that frames or receivers of different weapons are combined to create a similar weapon. Each retain their respective classifications as frames or receivers, provided they retain their original design and configuration. I think that's what happens if you take a bunch of guns apart and put them all back together with different parts, but I don't know. This supplement to the general definition addresses one of the core problems of the current definition of firearm frame or receiver, namely that the majority of firearms now use a split or modular design in which more than one part houses a different fire control component or other, incorporates a striker fire instead of a hammer. It would be clear that even though a firearm, including a silencer, may have more than one part that falls within the definition of frame or receiver, ATF may classify a specific part or parts to be the frame or receiver of a particular weapon. For this reason, manufacturers may wish to submit samples to the ATF for classification of one or more of the particular components as the frame or receiver so that they don't need to mark a specific part or parts of a weapon rather than all the qualifying parts, or obtain a marking variance. However, the supplemental definition would make it clear that ATF would not classify an internal frame or chassis as a frame or receiver unless it is at least partially exposed to the exterior to allow identification so that licensees accepting them into inventory can click and record the identifying marks, and law enforcement officers who recover the weapon can easily see the identifying marks for tracing purposes. One important goal of this rule is to ensure that it does not affect existing ATF classifications of firearms that specifically a single component as the frame or receiver, that specify a single component as a frame or receiver. Application of the rule as proposed would not alter those prior ATF classifications. To provide more clarity, that's what we need. This supplement to the definition would include a non-exclusive list of common weapons with a split multi-piece frame or receiver configuration for which ATF has previously determined a specific part to be the frame or receiver. If a manufacturer produces or importer imports a firearm falling within one of these designs as they exist as of the date of publication of the final rule, it can refer to this list to know which part of the frame is the frame or receiver. The manufacturer or importer can then mark without needing to ask the ATF for classification. Wow, how nice. The non-exclusive list identifies the frame or receiver in the following firearms. I'm not going to read them, but they basically list a bunch of dumb guns that are old. However, if there's a present or future split or modular design in a firearm that is not capable or comparable to an existing classification, then the definition of frame or receiver would advise that more than one part is the frame or receiver, subject to marking and other requirements, unless a specific classification or marking variance was obtained by the ATF as described above. Partially complete, disassembled, or inoperable frame or receiver. This is one of my best parts. Every time I read an ATF document, this is one of my favorites. Because this is garbage. This is making you have illegal garbage. This third supplement would define frame or receiver to include, in the case of a frame or receiver that is partially complete, disassembled, or inoperable, a frame or receiver that has reached a stage in manufacture where it may be readily completed, assembled, converted, or restored to a functional state. To determine this status, the director may consider any of the available instructions, guides, templates, jigs, equipment, tools, or other marketing materials. For clarification, partially complete for purposes of this definition means a forging, casting, printing, extrusion, machined body, or similar article that has reached a stage in manufacture where it is clearly identifiable as an unfinished component of a part of a weapon. Yes. This supplement addresses another core challenge of the existing definition of firearm frame or receiver, namely that it does not address the question of when an object becomes a frame or receiver. I want to insert a joke there, and I'm not commenting. When the Gun Control Act and implementing regulations define a firearm to include the frame or receiver, neither delineates when a frame or receiver is created. There's so many jokes right there. The crucial inquiry then, this is a whole thing is an injury. The crucial inquiry then is the point at which the unregulated piece of metal, plastic, or other material becomes a regulated item under the federal law. ATF has long held that a piece of metal, plastic, or other material becomes a frame or receiver when it has reached a critical stage of manufacture. This is the point at which a substantial step has been taken or a critical line crossed so that the item in question may so be classified under the law. The critical stage of manufacture is when the article becomes sufficiently complete to function as a frame or receiver, or may be readily completed, assembled, converted, or restored to accept the parts it is intended to house or hold. Clarifying this issue is needed to deter the increased sale or distribution. Clarifying this is needed to deter. I'm going to just say this again. Clarifying this is needed to deter. Is that policy? Is that policy right there? Is that they're trying to? All right, I'm not commenting. Clarifying this issue is needed to deter the increased sale or distributions of unlicensed and unregulated, partially complete or unassembled frames or receivers, often sold with parts kits that can be readily completed or assembled in the functional state. Many kits that include unfinished frames or receivers have been sold by non-licensees, you people, who were not required to run a background check or maintain transaction records. Accordingly, oh, nice. Look at this. I'm not commenting, but they're commenting. Accordingly, prohibited persons have easily obtained them. You people let criminals have them. I'm not commenting, but the ATF knows that you people let criminals have your guns, your 80% guns. Moreover, without any markings, they are nearly impossible to trace. I'm sad because the ATF has a difficult job. I'm not commenting. Although this edition is intended to capture when an item becomes a frame or receiver that is regulated irrespective of the type of technology used to complete the assembly, frame, or receiver, molds that can accept metal or polymer, unformed blocks of metal, and other articles in a primordial, it says primordial state, would not, without more, be considered a partial. All right, I'm going to try to read this again. Although this addition is intended to capture when an item becomes a frame or receiver that is regulated, irrespective of the type of technology used to complete the assembly, frame or receiver molds that can accept metal or polymer, unformed blocks of metal, and other articles only in a primordial state, would not, without more, be considered a partially complete frame or receiver. It's like 80%, 80%. Well, if this thing is almost kind of a gun, then it's the same as being a gun. I'm not going to comment though. However, when a frame or receiver is broken or has been disassembled into pieces that can readily be made into a frame or receiver, it is partially complete frame or receiver, forging, casting, or additive printing. That has reached a stage of manufacture where it can be readily made into a functional frame or receiver. That article would be a frame or receiver. Oh my goodness. Destroyed frame or receiver. All right, we're back to this. This fourth supplement would exclude from the definition of frame or receiver any frame or receiver that is destroyed. Are we going to get a definition of destroyed? The supplement describes what it means to be a destroyed frame or receiver. One, permanently altered, not to provide housing or a structure that may hold or integrate any fire control group or essential internal component, and that may not be readily assembled, completed, or converted to restored to functional state. This new definition would then set forth non-exclusive acceptable methods of destruction which have been provided by the ATF in past guidance. Oh, now we're going to get the definition of readily. You people think you know what readily means? Here's ATF telling you what it means. So to provide guidance on how the term readily is used to classify firearms, including frame or receiver parts kits or weapons parts kits sold with incomplete or unassembled frames or receivers, the NPRM, oh look at it, if you say it fast, it sounds like emperor. The NPRM, and defined as a process that is fairly or reasonably efficient, quick, and easy, but not necessarily the most efficient and speedy and easy process. Readily, a process that is fairly or reasonably efficient, quick, and easy, but not necessarily the most efficient, speedy, or efficient. All right, efficient, speedy, or easy. I love it. That's probably a definition. Here's the definition. All right, I'm going over here to see if Walt's still going. That was a 15-minute video. If you get sick of this, you can go watch Walt. I don't think this has anything to do with Walt. All right, so it would further list factors relevant in making the determining to include time, how long it takes to finish the process. And that would be, I guess, an expert or a monkey, or somewhere in the middle between expert and a monkey. Ease, how difficult it is to do so. And that, oh my goodness, expertise, I'm going to not comment. Expertise, what level of knowledge and skill are required. Equipment, what tools are required. Availability, whether additional parts are required, how easy they can be obtained. Expense, how much does it cost? Scope, mouthwash. I mean, the extent to which the subject and process must be changed to finish it. And the process would damage, hold on, move something. Whether the process would damage or destroy the subject of the process or cause it to malfunction. This definition and factors considered in determining whether a weapon, including a weapon's parts kits or unfinished or damaged frame or receiver, may readily be assembled, completed, converted, or restored to a function that are based on a case law interpreting firearms, may readily be converted to expel a projectile, and can be readily restored to shoot. Thus, defining the term readily is necessary to provide further clarity in determining when incomplete weapons or configurations of parts become firearm regulated under the Gun Control Act and the National Firearms Act. That's tough. Definitions of complete weapon and complete muffler or silencer device. This proposed rule would add definitions for a complete weapon and complete muffler or silencer device. A complete weapon would be defined as a firearm other than a firearms muffler or firearms silencer that contains all component parts necessary to function as designed, whether or not assembled or operable. Likewise, a complete muffler or silencer device would be defined as a firearm muffler or firearm silencer that contains all the component parts necessary to function as designed, whether or not assembled or operable. These definitions are needed to explain when a frame or receiver of a firearm, including a firearm muffler or silencer, as the case may be, must be marked. How is it less confusing to call it a firearm muffler or silencer every time? Definition of a privately made firearm. The NPRM proposes adding a definition of privately made firearm to mean a firearm, including a frame or receiver, assembled or otherwise produced by a person other than a licensed manufacturer and without a serial number or other identifying marks placed by a licensed manufacturer at the time the firearm was produced. The term would not include a firearm identified and registered in the end of blah, 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 pursuant to chapter stuff, and in any firearm made before October 22, 1968, unless remanufactured after that date? What? This proposed definition explains that personally manufactured firearms are those firearms that were made by non-licensees without the markings requirement by this part, and excludes those that are already marked and registered in the thing, and any firearm made before enactment of the Gun Control Act, which, unlike the repealed law it replaced, required all firearms to be marked under federal law. Unlike the repealed law it replaced, I want to push that person over. The term made is incorporated within the term privately. I'm going to say this again. The term made is incorporated within the term privately made firearm, rather than manufacturer, to distinguish between firearms manufactured or made by private individuals without a license and those manufactured by persons licensed to engage in the business of manufacturing firearms. Definition of import. Did they give us the definition of? I guess they did. So, definition of importers or manufacturer serial number. The proposed rule would define the term importers, manufacturers, or importer or manufacturer serial number in the identification number, licensee name, licensee city, state, or licensee number. The identification number, licensee name, licensee city or state, or licensee number placed on by a licensee on a firearm. I guess it's saying or, not and, right, for a reason, okay. On a firearm or receiver in accordance with this part. The term shall include any such identification on a privately made firearm or an ATF issued serial number, because privately made firearms are manufactured by someone other than the licensed manufacturer. The serial number that incorporates the abbreviated federal firearms license number placed by a licensee on a privately made firearm under this rule is the importer or manufacturer serial number. This definition would help ensure that the serial numbers and other markings necessary to ensure tracing, including those placed by a licensee on a privately made firearm or marked with an ATF issued serial number, to include imported firearms, are considered the importer's or manufacturer's serial number, which prohibits their removal, obliteration, or alteration. That's a tough one. And then we'll get to a definition of gunsmith to provide greater access to professional marking. This proposed rule would clarify that the meaning of the term gunsmith includes persons who engage in the business of identifying firearms for non-licensees, so that gunsmiths may become licensed as dealer gunsmiths solely to provide the professional privately made firearm marking services. Specifically, this proposed rule would amend the definition of engaged in business as it applies to a gunsmith to clarify the meaning as to someone who, as a service performed in an existing firearms not for sale or distribution by a licensee, devotes time, attention, and labor to repairing or customizing firearms, making or fitting special barrels, mechanisms, or trigger mechanism, or identifying firearms in accordance with this chapter as a regular course of trade or business with the principal objective, livelihood, or profit, but such term shall not include a person who occasionally repairs or customizes firearms or occasionally makes or fits special barrel stocks or trigger mechanisms to firearms. Oh, that definitely clears it up. Thank you. This amendment would make it clear that businesses that routinely repair or customize existing firearms, make or fit special barrel stocks or trigger mechanisms, or mark firearms as a service performed on firearms not for sale or distribution by a licensee may be licensed as dealer gunsmiths rather than as manufacturers. Under this rule, personal made firearms would first need to be recorded by the dealer gunsmith as an acquisition in the licensee's A&D record upon receipt from the private owner, whether or not the licensee keeps the PMF overnight. And once marked, the licensee would update the acquisition entry with identifying information and then record its return as a disposition to the private owner. This would ensure that the PMF, if ever found by police at a crime scene, can be traced. However, no ATF Form 73 background check would be required upon the return of the marked firearm from the person whom once it was received. Great. Marking requirements for firearms. Information required to be marked on the firearm frame or receiver. To properly implement the new definitions, this proposed rule would amend the law to explain how and when markings must be applied on each part defined as a frame or receiver, particularly since there could be more than one part of a complete weapon or complete muffler or silencer device that is the frame or receiver. After publication of a final rule, each frame or receiver of a new firearm design or configuration manufactured or imported after the date of publication of the final rule would need to be marked with a serial number and either the manufacturer's importer's name or recognized abbreviation and city and state or recognized abbreviation where the manufacturer importer maintains their place of business, or in the case of a maker of an NFA item where the firearm was made, or the manufacturer's import name, and the serial number beginning with the licensee's abbreviated FFL number as a prefix, which is the first three letters of the last 5 digits, followed by a hyphen, and then followed by a number, which may incorporate letters and a hyphen. The serial number with or without FFL prefix identified on each part of the weapon and defined as a frame or receiver must be the same number, but it must not duplicate any serial numbers placed on the licensee on any other firearm. So, holy moly. The additional information required to be marked on each firearm, frame, or receiver would only apply to new designs or configurations of firearms manufactured or imported after publication of the rule. Licensed manufacturers and importers may continue to identify the additional information on firearms of the same design and configuration as they existed before the existed date of the rule under the prior content rules, and as any rules necessary to ensure such identification would remain effective for that purpose, this provision is intended to reduce production costs incurred by licensees. So I think they're just saying you don't have to change all your tooling, right? Next. Oh no, that's pretty much, I think, the way everybody's feeling about that, dude. Or this whole thing. Again, this isn't something that anybody wants to do. This is something they're shoving down our throats, and it's our obligation or responsibility to be aware of what they're doing, right? Uh-oh, I shouldn't have done that. No, I don't know where I'm at. I think this is it. Requiring firearms licensees to mark in this manner, each part identified. Huh. So with the typo, do we still have to deal with this? There's a typo. We should not have to even read this whole thing. As a frame or receiver would make it possible for ATF to trace the firearm if the manufacturer or importer's name, cities marked on the side of the barrel, and the original components are later separated. At the same time, it would give an option for the manufacturer and importer to avoid marking their city and state as currently required. Except for silencer parts transferred by manufacturers to other qualified manufacturers and dealers for completion or repair of devices, there would be no change to the existing requirement that each part defined as a machine gun or silencer that is disposed of separately and not part of a complete weapon or device may be marked with all the required information because individual machine gun conversion and silencer parts are firearms under the NFA that must be registered. However, for frames or receivers and individual machine gun conversion or silencer parts defined as firearms that are disposed of separately, the model designation and caliber or gauge may be omitted if it is unknown at the time the part's identified. Man, that's a lot of detail. Size and depth of markings. The proposed rule would not change the existing requirements for size and depth of markings, but for sake of clarity, consolidates them into a standalone paragraph along with the existing method of measuring the size and depth of markings. Period of time to identify firearms. Neither the Gun Control Act or the NFA explain at what point in the manufacturing process required markings must be placed. In this regard, the proposed rule would make a distinction between the manufacture or making of a complete weapon or a complete muffler and each part, including a replacement part as designed by a framer, receiver, machine gun, or firearms muffler silencer that is not a component part of a complete weapon or device at the time it is sold, shipped, or otherwise disposed. Complete weapons or complete muffler or silencer devices as defined in this rule would be allowed to be marked up to 7 days from completion of the active manufacturing process of the weapon or device or prior to disposition, whichever is sooner. Wow, that's different. Except for silencer parts produced by qualified manufacturers for transfer to other licensees to complete their repair silencer devices. This is super boring. Parts defined as a framer, receiver, machine gun, or firearms muffler or firearms silencer are not component parts of a complete weapon or device when disposed of, would allow to be marked up to 7 days following the date of completion of manufacturing. Avoiding this language would codify ATF blah blah, and this ruling would obsolete upon publication as explained. That is a ruling whether the end product is to become a complete weapon or device or a framer receiver disposed of separately. The firearms that are actively awaiting materials parts are completed considerably actively in the manufacturing process. Okay, they just described how difficult it is to figure out when they're machine guns, and then they basically just said somewhere in there you have 7 days. So they didn't even say, they just said that there's now 7 days. All right, because marking of privately made firearms, this is for you people. Because privately made firearms do not have the identifying markings required of commercially manufactured firearms, this rule proposes to amend the law to require FFLs to mark or supervise the marking of the same serial number on each frame or receiver as defined by this rule of a weapon that begins with the FFL's abbreviated license number, first three. What? So you don't even get to put your own serial number on your own gun. You got to go to the FFL and they put their serial number on there. That's a little extra BS. Anyway, I'm not commenting. As a prefix followed by a hyphen, a licensee acquired, unless previously identified by another licensee, personally manufactured firearms acquired by licensees on or after the effective date of the rule would need to be marked in this manner within 7 days of receipt of the acquisition, including from personal collection, or before the date of the disposition, whichever is sooner. The personally manufactured firearms acquired by licensees before the effective date of this rule, licensees would be required to mark or cause them to be marked by another licensee either within 60 days from that date or before the date of the final disposition, whichever is sooner. With respect to polymer firearms, including those that are produced according or using additive manufacturing, known as 3D printing, the method of marking would typically require the licensee to embed or use pre-existing metal serial number plates within the plastic to ensure they cannot be worn away during normal use. Incorporation of this metal plate along with other metal components would also help to ensure the polymer firearm does not violate the Undetectable Firearms Act. If you don't know what the Undetectable Firearms Act is, then you're really not 2A. So let's put that in here. Which prohibits the manufacture and possession of firearms that are not as detectable as the security Emplar that contains 3.7 ounces of material of type 7-4 pH stainless steel. Of course, all guns have to have that. PMFs currently in the inventory that a licensee chooses to not mark may also be destroyed or voluntarily turned into law enforcement within the 60-day period. Also, this proposed rule would not require federal firearms licensees to accept any PMFs or to mark them themselves. Licensees would be able to refuse to accept PMFs or arrange for private individuals to have them marked by another licensee before accepting them, provided they are properly marked in accordance with this proposed rule. To provide greater access to professional marking, as stated above, the rule would clarify the meaning of the term gunsmith includes persons who engage in the business of identifying firearms for non-licensees so that gunsmiths may become licensed as dealer gunsmiths solely to provide professional PMF marking services. It's creating jobs, everybody. It's creating jobs. Consistent with the language and purpose of the Gun Control Act, this proposed provision is necessary to allow ATF to trace all firearms acquired and disposed of by licensees, prevent illicit firearms trafficking, and provide guidance to FFLs and the public with respect to personal manufactured firearms transactions with the licensed community. This provision is crucial in light of advances in technology that allow unlicensed persons, that's you people, easily to produce firearms at home from parts ordered online or by using 3D printers or personally owned leased equipment, because a lot of us lease our 3D printers. Such privately made firearms have and will continue to make their way to primary market in firearms throughout the licensed community. The licensed community is better than the unlicensed community. At the same time, consistent with the intent of the Gun Control Act, nothing in this rule would restrict persons not otherwise prohibited from possessing firearms from making their own firearms at home without markings solely for personal use. In accordance with federal, state, and local law, persons should consult the laws and officials in their own states and local localities to determine the lawfulness of PMFs, because your PMF might not be lawful. Meaning of marking terms. An additional amendment to law would clarify the meaning of the terms legible and legibly to ensure that the identification marks use exclusively Roman letters and Arabic numerals, or solely Arabic numerals and may include a hyphen, and that the terms conspicuous and conspicuously are also understood to mean that the identification markings are capable of being easily seen with normal handling of the firearm and unobstructed by other markings when the complete weapon is assembled. This would codify the meaning of those terms as explained in the law. And ATF's final rule referencing U.S. Customs Service regulations on the definition of conspicuous. All right, section 6. It looks like we're a third of the way through. So I hope you're ready for 2/3 more of this. This is horrible. This has gone on for an hour and a half, so that means we got like another 5 hours of this. It's horrible. Alternate means or period of identification. This proposed rule would not alter the director's ability to authorize other means of identification or marking variants for any part defined as a firearm, including a machine gun or silencer, upon receipt of a letter of application or application for alternative means of identification of firearms, variants, showing that such other identification is reasonable and does not hinder the effective administration of regulations. The amendment would also allow ATF to grant a variance to the period in which, of the period in which to mark firearms, from the period in which to mark firearms. I think that's for historic stuff in museums, maybe regular people if you want to wait in line. Okay, next section 7, destructive device, period of identification. Super critical importance. Similar to other firearms, because the proposed rule would now specify the 7-day grace period in which mark all firearms completed, including destructive devices, this rule would also allow ATF to grant a variance from this period. The marking requirements for destructive devices are otherwise unchanged. Okay, that's a waste of time, confusing sentence for no reason. Adopting and identifying markings. Adoption of identifying markings. I'm getting loopy. I gotta drink some water. Is anybody still listening to this? I drank coffee before this. Adoption of identifying markings. This rule proposes to authorize licensed manufacturers and importers to adopt an existing serial number, caliber gauge, model, or other markings already identified on a firearm, provided they legibly and conspicuously place or cause to be placed on each part defined as a frame or receiver either their name, their city and state where they maintain their place of business, or their name and their abbreviated FFL number, which is the first 3 and last 5, followed by a hyphen, then followed by blah, 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 blah. To ensure the traceability of the firearm, the language would supersede ATF ruling that it applies to licensed manufacturers and importers, but the ruling would remain effective for makers of NFA firearms. This change would help avoid multiple markings on firearms that could be confusing to law enforcement because they're confused, and alleviate concerns from some of the manufacturers and importers regarding serial number duplication when firearms are remanufactured or reimported. Nice. Firearms, I'm not commenting. Firearm muffler, or silencer parts transferred between qualified licensees. Licensed and qualified firearms muffler or silencer manufacturers routinely transfer small internal muffler or silence components to each other, which is still legal, to produce complete devices, and between qualified licensees when repairing existing devices. Because of the difficulties and expense of marking and registering small individual components used to commercially manufacture a complete muffler or silencer device with little law enforcement benefit, this proposed rule would allow qualified manufacturers to transfer parts defined as a firearms muffler or silencer to other qualified manufacturers without immediately identifying or registering them. Once the new device is complete with the part, the manufacturer would be required to identify and register the device in the manner and within the period specified in this rule for a complete device. Likewise, the proposed rule would allow qualified manufacturers to transfer muffler or silencer replacement parts to qualified manufacturers and dealers to repair existing devices already identified and registered in the Unfunded. Further, this rule would amend the definition of transfer to clarify that the temporary conveyance of a lawfully possessed NFA firearm, including a silencer, to a qualified manufacturer or dealer for the sole purpose of repair, identification, evaluation, research, testing, or calibration, and return to the same lawful possessor is not a transfer requiring additional identification or registration with the Unfunded. This change would be consistent with the definition of whatever. Because of a temporary conveyance, I think for the purposes, this is not a sale or other disposition. These proposed rule changes are intended to reduce the practical and administrative problems of marking and registering silencer parts by the regulated industry and avoid a potential resource burden on ATF and to provide a potential resource burden on ATF. Now you're worried about a resource burden. Every AR-15 has to go into the books, but that's not a resource burden. I'm not commenting though. To process the numerous tax-exempt registration applications with the public safety benefit, or with little public safety benefit. Voluntary classification of firearms and armor-piercing ammunition. Because why don't we put armor-piercing ammunition in here? Because why not, right? Let's do it. For many years, ATF has acted on voluntary requests from persons, particularly the manufacturers, who are developing new products by issuing determinations, classifications, whether an item is a firearm or armor-piercing ammunition, as defined by the Gun Control Act or the National Firearms Act. This helps regulated industry members and public determine what laws and regulations may be applicable to the product and any steps that they may need to take to be compliant with those laws and regulations. To clarify this process, this proposed rule would set forth the procedure and conditions by which persons may voluntarily submit such requests to ATF. Each request must be submitted in writing on an ATF form executed under the penalties of perjury with a complete and accurate description of the item. So now you're going to jail if you ask them a question wrong. All right, I'm not commenting though. Each request would be submitted in writing on an ATF form executed under the penalties of perjury with a complete and accurate description of the item, the name, address, manufacturer, or importer thereof, and a sample of such item for examination, along with any instructions, guides, templates, jigs, equipment, tools, or marketing materials that are made available to the purchaser of the recipient or the recipient of the item. Upon completion of the examination, the ATF may return the sample to the person who made the request unless the determination is made that return of the sample would be or place the person in violation of law. So I'm not commenting. ATF's decision whether to classify an item voluntarily submitted is entirely discretionary. The proposed procedure would assist ATF more effectively to determine the design and intent of the manufacturer of the item through its written statements and by examining the objective design features of an actual sample, along with any instructions, guides, templates, jigs, equipment, tools, or marketing materials that are made available to the purchaser or recipient of the item. Though ATF is not limited to examining the item submitted to make its determination. The proposed rule would further codify ATF's policy to not evaluate a firearm accessory or attachment unless it is installed on the firearm in the configuration for which it is designed and intended to be used, and would further explain that a determination made by the director under this paragraph shall not be deemed by any person to be applicable or authoritative with respect to any other sample design or model or configuration. There is no ATF director, so that's a lot of references to the director. I'm not commenting though. Record keeping, acquisition and disposition of records. This proposed rule would make minor amendments, no big deal, pertaining to the acquisition and disposition of records maintained by importers, manufacturers, and dealers. Due to the possibility that a firearm may have more than one frame or receiver as defined by this rule, and the changes to marking requirements, and this rule would make technical amendments to the record-keeping regulations to make certain words plural and serial numbers in the regulations for the formatting of the records as applicable. Although under subsection whatever, singular terms in the regulations must always be read to include the plural form and vice versa. These changes are necessary to ensure that the firearm FFLs record more than one manufacturer, importer, or serial number if appropriate, when acquiring or disposing of firearms with multiple components marked with the frame, marked as the frame or receiver, that have been remanufactured or re-imported by another licensee. This is consistent with the prior ATF guidance to the firearms industry. So it's like saying if you re-import something, it gets a second serial number, I think. However, to reduce costs incurred by licensees, ATF anticipates that it would exercise its discretion not to enforce these format changes to the A&D record until the existing paper record book is completed, or an electronic record version updated in the normal course of business, provided the information is accurately recorded as required by the existing record. Over the years, licensed importers and manufacturers have asked the ATF to allow them to consolidate their records of importation or manufacture and acquisition and disposition of firearms rather than maintaining separate records as required by law. Because separate records are also difficult for ATF to inspect, this rule would amend subsection whatever to require licensed importers and manufacturers to consolidate. Oh, now it's going to require importers and manufacturers to consolidate their records of importation, manufacture, and other acquisition, and their sale of other disposition in a format containing the applicable columns specified in a table included in subsection whatever. The columns may be in a different order than the specified format, provided they contain all the required information. These changes would supersede this stuff, and then the rulings would become obsolete upon publication of the final rule. So if you own software and it puts it in a certain amount of columns, go buy more software. This rule would also make minor clarifying edits to the format of the distribution record. The column titled name and address or name and license number would be retitled as name and address of non-licensee, or if licensee, name and license number. If, in addition, the column titled address or licensee number, if license, okay, I'm not going to read every single change to the form. The proposed changes would also include a minor amendment to the paragraph to make it clear that in the event of the licensee records a duplicate entry with the same firearm and acquisition information, whether to close out an old record book or for any other reason, the licensee must record a reference to the date and location of the subsequent entry. That's not even new. Change is needed to ensure that acquisition records are closed out when firearms are no longer in inventory. This would, I don't imagine there's any firearms book with an empty book gun in there. Okay, so firearms transaction records, some technical amendments would be needed pertaining to information recorded on the 4473, like changes to the record keeping regulations. These amendments would make certain words plural, importers serial numbers to ensure, oh nice, serial numbers, now that's a plural. I'm not commenting, to ensure that the federal firearms licensee is recording more than one manufacturer, importer, and serial number if appropriate on forms. In addition, the proposed changes would include a minor technical amendment to paragraph F by removing a phrase that indicates that FFL must fill out the firearms description information only after filling out the information about the transferee. Making this deletion would codify ATF procedure, which sets an alternative method for complying with over-the-counter firearms transactions. ATF recently issued that the procedure, in light of changes to the 4473, which now requires completion of the form in order for a different type is provided. Obviously, I didn't even need to say that because you all were aware of that. Next up is record keeping for privately made firearms. Minor changes to the above regulations regarding record keeping by licensees would also be needed to account for any voluntary receipts or other acquisitions, including of privately made firearms and corresponding dispositions, including personal collection, since personally made firearms are not commercially manufactured. If a personally made firearm were received or otherwise required by a licensee or disposed of or imported, in the abbreviation PMF would be recorded as the manufacturer in the appropriate column on a licensee acquisition and disposition record of 4473 or the import application, as well as the PMF serial number beginning with the, oh nice, FFL number and the serial number PMFs. So they're going to all have serial number PMF? What a bunch of jerks. Received. Well, that's not even this. You can write your own serial number. Why are they making it so you can't write your own serial number? So I'm not commenting. Personal-made firearms received prior to the effective date of a final rule that are identified as the licensee in accordance with by another licensee at the licensee request, the licensee would be required to first record the firearm as an acquisition in the records upon receipt from the private owner, that's you people. Whether or not the licensee keeps it overnight, once marked, the licensee would update the acquisition with the identifying and then return it to the private owner. However, to reduce costs incurred by licensees, ATF anticipates that it would exercise its discretion not to enforce a title format change to the A&D record to add PMF in the manufacturer column until existing paper record book is complete or the electronic versions are updated. Then you will have to have PMF in the manufacturer column or go to jail, but no big deal. Not until they come up with new software. So you've got a little while. All right, NFA forms update. Minor technical amendments would be needed pertaining to Form 1s, let's go, Form 4s and all the other forms, and lost or stolen firearms reports respectively. Due to the new definitions and changes making regulations, the technical amendments would make certain words plural. We are so used to having fluid things that we used to have as static things that we're all used to changing things to plural. We're good with that. So manufacturers are now, or manufacturer is now a manufacturer, and an importer is now an importers, and a serial number is now serial numbers. And then we'll get to importation forms update. We're not even halfway through this whole thing. So this is going to take more than 4 hours to read this whole thing. So this is the fault of the government who's wasting everybody's time. Somebody got paid a bunch of money to write this. Think about how much money somebody got paid to write this. It was probably like a bunch of people. Minor technical amendments would also be needed pertaining to the importation of firearms. Again, due to the definition and changes in marking regulations, the technical amendments here would make certain words plural. Woo! All right, I'm just going to start bypassing all the shit that's words that are going to be plural. This rule also is to amend and remove language stating that the FFL dealers and collectors only need to keep A&D records and ATF forms for up to 20 years. The proposed changes will require FFLs to retain all records until business or license activity is discontinued. No big deal. No big deal. Just forever. It's just forever. It's no big deal. Either on paper or in electric format approved by the director, which there is no director, but doesn't matter, at the business or collection premises readily acceptable for inspection. So just keep them forever and have them ready when we need them. There would also be an amendment to allow all licensees, including manufacturers or importers, to store their paper records and forms with no open disposition entries and no dispositions recorded within 20 years at a separate warehouse for which would be considered part of the business premises for this purpose and subject to inspection. So wherever you put your records there, they have access. In view of advancements in electronic scanning and storage technology and ATF's acceptance of electronic record keeping, these amendments would reverse a 1985 rulemaking allowing non-manufactured of FFLs to destroy their records after 20 years. We don't need to destroy those anymore. The durability and longevity of firearms means that they are often in circulation for more than 20 years. While the cost of storing a firearm transaction record has decreased, it doesn't cost an FFL nothing. It's free to keep 20 years worth of records. It's free, especially if it's electronic. I'm not commenting. The proposed amendments would enhance public safety. I'll just read that again because it's important. The proposed amendments would enhance public safety by ensuring that records of active licensees will be available for tracing purposes. ATF has encountered some firearms retailers who have destroyed large numbers of records more than 20 years old, so they'd no longer be needed to be stored physically. Oh. This resulted in some traces of firearms involved in crimes to be returned incomplete for lack of records. This provision is also essential if personally manufactured, personally made firearms involved in crime are marked and traced directly to licensed dealers, who, unlike licensed manufacturers and importers, are not presently required to maintain. I'm not commenting. I'm going to read this again, though. This provision is also essential if personally made firearms involved in crime are marked and traced directly to licensed dealers who, unlike licensed manufacturers and importers, are not presently required to make permanent records, maintain permanent records. Not currently. Soon they'll have to maintain permanent records. No big deal. All right, section 3. We're up to section 3 already, everybody. Statutory and executive order review. This is the part that a lot of people enjoy the most. Oh, Honda's out here. He digs this part. Statutory and executive order review. Executive orders 12866 and 13563. Those are the best ones. Executive Order 12866, Regulatory Planning and Review, directs agencies to assess the costs and benefits of available regulatory alternatives, and if regulation is necessary, to select regulatory approaches that maximize net benefits, including potential economic benefits, environmental benefits, public health and safety effects, distributive impacts, and equity. Executive Order 13563, improving regulation and regulatory review. This emphasizes the importance of quantifying both costs and benefits, of reducing costs, of harmonizing rules, and promoting flexibility. You're going to be real flexible at the end of all this. You're going to get able to be bent over really well. The Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, has determined that while this proposed rule is not economically significant, it's a significant regulatory action under section whatever, because this proposed rule raises novel legal or policy issues arising out of legal mandates. Accordingly, the rule has been reviewed by the OMBA. This proposed rule would update the new definition of frame or receiver, among other items. Table 1 provides a summary of the provisions of this proposed rule, along with the estimated affected population, costs, and benefits. Thank you, OMBA, for giving us a pic. It's not really a picture, it's a table, but we don't have to read so much. So table 1, first table, summary of affected population, costs, and benefits. This is who's going to really benefit from this. So the category is applicability, and the NEMPRUM is new definition of receiver. Nice. Updated marketing requirements. Awesome. New gunsmith definition. That's incredible. Updated record retention. This is so clear. I'm glad they put this in a chart, because for me, this makes it much easier to understand. Other technical amendments is the words in this box. And then it says affected population over here. Then it says, I guess, 113,000 FFLs, record retention. Then it goes unknown number of FFLs, manufacturers and importers, definition of receiver. Wow. And then we go to 35 non-FFL manufacturers. It's like 35 non-FFL manufacturers out there are going to learn about the definition of receiver. And then we got 6,000 FFL retailers, and they're all going to get PMFs, I guess. We got 36 non-FFL retailers, and that's in this box. And it has a little bullet point in front of it. This is the dumbest table I've ever seen, and it doesn't tell us anything. This is the government for you. Somebody got paid to put this dumbass table together that tells us nothing, and it puts a bunch of stuff that we just read into a box. It's manipulative. I believe that's manipulative. Next, the new definition of a firearms frame or receiver. The proposed definition of this term would maintain current classifications and current marking requirements of firearm frames or receivers, except that the licensed manufacturer or importer must mark on new designs or configurations either their name, city and state, where they maintain their place of business, or their name and abbreviated FFL number, which we all know, so don't say it here, on each part defined as a frame or receiver, along with the serial number. To ensure traceability, if the parts are separated, there would be no longer be an option to mark only the FFL's name, city, and state on just the slide or the barrel. More specifically, the proposed definitions would take into account the fact that modern firearms do not house all the components as defined by the current definition. These firearm definitions account for firearms such as split frames or multi-piece firearms. The proposed definition would recognize the current classifications of a firearm frame or receiver. It is intended to encompass the majority, if not all, of existing regulated firearms, and no new marking requirements would be required for those existing designs and configurations. After this proposed rule is finalized, markings on new designs or configurations of firearms manufactured or imported may be accomplished by marking each frame or receiver with the licensee's name, city, state, serial number, or with the licensee's name and abbreviated license number, prefix and number, serial number in the manner prescribed by existing marking requirements. Markings would need to be accomplished within 7 days of completion of the active manufacturing process for the complete weapon or frame or receiver of such weapon, if not being sold as a complete weapon. And the proposed rule would require acquisition and disposition records changes to accommodate recording multiple frames or receivers that have different serial numbers along with their original frames and receivers become separated and reassemble with frames or receivers bearing different serial numbers, because that's going to never happen. ATF believes that the majority of the industry currently complies with these requirements, so the cost would be minimal. Yeah. While the new definitions would mostly affect new designs or configurations of firearms, manufacturers would still be able to receive a determination or a variance on the form ATF. There may not experience an additional cost or burden. Partially complete, disassembled, or inoperable firearms kits. These are the worst. This section addresses non-FFL manufacturers who manufacture partially complete, disassembled, or inoperable frame or receiver kits to include both firearm parts and kits that allow a person to make only a frame or receiver, and those kits that allow a person to make a complete weapon. When a partially complete frame or receiver part kit reaches a stage in manufacture where it may be readily completed, assembled, converted, or restored to a functional state, it would be considered a firearm, frame, or receiver that must be marked. Furthermore, under the proposed rule, weapon parts kits with partially complete receivers or receivers containing the necessary parts that they may be readily completed, assembled, converted, or restored to expel a projectile by the action of an explosive would be firearms, for which each frame or receiver of the weapon as defined under this rule would need to be marked. For non-FFL manufacturers, you people, of firearms parts kits containing the parts defined as firearm, frame, or receiver, ATF anticipates there would be a significant impact on these individual companies, but notes that the overall industry impact would be also minimal. Based on current marketing related to the unregulated sale of certain firearms parts kits, ATF anticipates that these non-FFLs would either become FFLs, no big deal, or sell regulated frames or receivers, or to sell regulated frames or receivers or complete weapons, either as kits or fully assembled, or would take a loss in revenue to sell unregulated items, such as parts kits that do not contain a frame or receiver. Oh, okay, but not both. So I'm not trying to comment, but as long as you take that out of the box and put it over there, you don't need an FFL. But if you put that in the box, you do need an FFL. Okay. Gunsmithing. The proposed rule would result in a one-time cost for contract gunsmithing estimated. What the hell? The proposed rule would result in a one-time cost for contract gunsmithing estimated to be $180,849. What the hell did that come out of? What does that even mean? That's like the tiny paragraph in the middle of this whole thing, and I think did I get a bill for $180,000? Who the hell, what is this? What the hell is that? Why does that even say that there? The new definition. Oh my goodness. This is the government. What the hell is this? I can tell you about 100 times where I've been minding my business and a paragraph like this shows up. Ugh. And it gives you real confidence in what they're doing over there too. Real clear. Thanks for the clarity, ATF. All right, next, silencers, number 4. These are always easy to figure out. The proposed rule would require silencers to be marked on any housing or structure, such as an outer tube or modular piece, designed to hold or integrate one or more of the essential internal components of the device. Currently, the regulations assume that each part defined as a muffler or silencer be marked or registered. While this proposed change would increase the number of certain parts, firearms muffler or proposed change would increase the number of, certain parts, firearms, muffler, or silencer frames or receivers that need to be marked for modular silencers. This proposed change is not intended to require marking for all silencer parts so long as they are incorporated into the complete device by the original manufacturer or maker that is marked as registered. More specifically, none of the internal non-structural parts of a complete muffler or silencer device would be needed to be marked so long as each frame or receiver is defined in this rule marked. As defined in this rule are marked. However, with current regulations, silencer parts sold, shipped, or otherwise disposed of separately would still be considered silencers that require all markings prior to disposition, except when transferred between qualified manufacturers for the production of new devices and to qualified manufacturers and dealers for the repair of existing devices. I tell you, every time they have that paragraph, which has been in here like 8 times, it makes you mad that there's this whole situation. However, the proposed rule would now require some manufacturers of silencers to mark the outer tube rather than the end cap. ATF anticipates only minimal costs associated with moving the serial number and other identifying information from the end cap or adding the same information to the outer tube on certain silencers. So I'm just not commenting, but they're called silencers here. An hour ago, I had to say mufflers and suppressors like 1,000 times. Like, come on. This is manipulation. This whole thing is a giant mind game. Furthermore, there may be a savings for individual owners of silencers. So they're saving you money. I like it when the ATF saves you money. Maybe this is the money you're getting saved. You're going to save $180,849 estimated. Where was I? Suppressors, saving money, so long as they're incorporated. Current regulations, shipped or otherwise disposed of separately, will be considered silencers with car alarm markings prior to disposition, except when transferred between qualified manufacturers for the production of new devices and qualified manufacturers for the repair of existing devices. Oh, I think I already read that. Furthermore, there would be a savings for individual owners of silencers. This proposed rule would expressly allow for repairs on silencers devices without having to undergo additional NFA transfer and registration process. So as long as the device is returned to the sender. Nice. So you know how you have to pay so much now? Because of all this, you don't have to pay quite so much. For more details, please refer to some other place. All right, privately made firearms. Can't get enough of reiteration. Like, I'm glad that they're saying these things over and over and over again for no reason in separate paragraphs, just to make it longer. It's amazing, amazing use of the English language. Privately made firearms. A firearm, including a frame or receiver, assembled or otherwise produced by a non-licensee without any markings by a licensee at the time of production or importation is defined as a privately made firearm in the proposed rule. This does not include a firearm identified as and registered in the NTFR pursuant to made before October 22nd, 1968. Under the proposed rule, FFLs would be required to mark privately made firearms within 7 days of the firearm being received by the licensee or before disposition, whichever is first. Disposition means transfer out. I don't know why they call it disposition. It sounds stupid. Licensees would have 60 days to mark PMFs already in inventory after a final rule becomes effective. Nice. FFLs would have the option to mark their existing personally made firearms themselves. Nice. Both FFLs and non-FFLs would have the option to contract with an FFL, such as a gunsmith, for this purpose, dispose of them, or send them to the ATF or another law enforcement agency for disposal. The industry cost for this section is $563,340. For more details, go F yourself. So this costs, so they're like, no, it's not $563,339, and it's also not $563,341. It's going to cost $563,340 for the industry to do this. So they got it. They got it. That's the IRS helping us out, knowing how much stuff's going to cost us. I feel like they could have put that in this chart and said, like, here's your cost to not comply, and here's your cost to comply, and then just have a dollar sign in there. Make it a lot easier for us to know how much it costs us to do things. Record retention. Currently, licensees other than manufacturers, that wasn't commenting, by the way. I was just taking a second to read. Record retention. Currently, licensees other than manufacturers and importers do not have to store their ATF Form 4473s or A&D records beyond 20 years. It's horrible. I'm not commenting. This proposed rule would require licensed dealers and collectors to store their 4473 and records indefinitely. No big deal, just forever. The industry cost for this section would be minimal. It doesn't cost anything for FFLs to have a bunch of extra inventory. could drop off their overflow records to the ATF. It's no big deal. Just give your extra records to the ATF or have them shipped to the ATF directly. The government cost for this provision is just $68,939 annually. Just, not 40, not 38, but 39. And for more details, you can go after. ATF form updates. So this is number 7. Let's pluralize these words. This proposed rule would modify existing forms and records such as the 4473, the NFA forms, importation forms, lost or stolen firearms reports, A&D records to help ensure that if more than one manufacturer or serial number is identified on any firearm, these names or serial numbers are recorded. As paper forms run out, FFLs would be able to order forms as part of the normal operations. In other words, FFLs using paper forms requested by the ATF are not anticipated to incur any additional cost. The FFLs maintaining transition records electronically, those FFLs would also be required to update their software during the next regularly scheduled update. Because software updates occur regularly and the costs are already incorporated for those, ATF does not anticipate any additional cost to be incurred by these changes. There is no cost associated with this section. For more details, go after yourself. The total cost of the proposed rule. The total 10-year undiscounted, because we don't get a discount, cost of this proposed rule is estimated to be just 1.3 million. That's not a big deal. They're giving away trillions right now. This is like pennies compared to that. The total 10-year discounted cost is only 10 million. Holy crap, we're getting 0.3 million off. And 1.2 million at 7% and 3%. Did I just get a loan, right, to pay this off? The annualized cost of this proposed rule would be, I don't understand this. I think I got a new mortgage though. Alternatives. ATF considered various alternatives when preparing this proposed rule. For a more detailed analysis, please go F yourself. The proposed rule. The ATF chose to to make known to the public, to popularize or advocate. Never even heard of it. It is not popular to the public to use a word I never heard of. ATF chose to use a crazy ass word in the new definitions of frame or receiver, privately made firearm, gunsmithing, and an update to records retention and new requirements for making silencers because they would maximize benefits. Other considered alternatives. 1, no change. While this alternative minimizes cost, it does not meet any of the objectives outlined in this proposed rule. Alternative 2, every town for gun safety petition. ATF received a petition for rulemaking from Everytown for Gun Safety, a nonprofit organization proposing to define firearm frame or receiver that proposed the definition focused on the housing of the trigger group. However, it did not define the trigger group, and even if it did, it would not address the firearms that did not house the trigger components within a single housing or which had a remote trigger outside the weapon. In other words, this alternative would fall short of addressing all technologies or designs of firearms that are currently available or may become available in the future. It also does not address potential changes in firearms terminology. Thus, while the alternative requested by that petition would reduce the cost by reducing the number of entities affected, it does not fully address the objectives of this rule. Number 3, grandfather all existing firearms and receivers. This alternative would grandfather in all existing firearms that would not meet the serialization standard for partially complete and split frame receivers. This was considered and incorporated into the proposed alternative where feasible. However, in order to enforce the regulation, a complete grandfathering of existing firearms and silencers is problematic, and manufacturers can continue to produce non-compliant firearms frames or receivers and falsely market them as grandfathered items. This could potentially pose an enforcement issue that may not be resolved for years or even decades. So we're not going to do that. Alternative 4, require serialization of all partially complete receivers or split receivers. This would require that all firearms purchased by individuals be retroactively serialized. However, the cost would increase considerably, and the Gun Control Act only regulates the manufacture of firearms by federal firearms licensees, not the making of firearms for personal use by private unlicensed individuals. That's you people, unlicensed private individuals. It's still legal for you to be private and unlicensed as an individual, so we can't use alternative 4. All right, so this proposed rule would not have substantial direct effects on the states, the relationship between the federal government and the states, or the distribution of power and responsibilities among the various levels of government. This rule is not intended to supersede state requirements unless there is a direct or positive conflict between them that cannot be reconciled consistently, stand together. States can require markings on firearms for individuals. That does not require that the individuals to mark their personal firearms. Therefore, in accordance with Section 6 of the Executive Order, federalism, why they write that in there? Federalism. The Attorney General has determined that this proposed rule does not have sufficient federalism implications to warrant the preparation of a federalism summary impact statement. Why does it keep saying federalism? What am I missing there? Executive Order, this one, 12988. This regulation meets the acceptable standards set forth in sections 3A, 3B of Executive Order, whatever. So there you go. Regulatory Flexibility Act. In accordance with the Regulatory Flexibility Act, the RFA, ATF prepared an initial regulatory, an IRFA, that examines the impacts of the proposed rule on small entities. I wonder if you're a small entity or if the ATF is a small entity. The IRFA is included here and is part of the RFA. The term small entities, here we go, comprises small businesses, nonprofit organizations that are independently owned and operated or not dominant in their fields, and not dominant in their fields. Nice. So you can't be dominant in your field and be a nonprofit because that would be unfair. So you can only be one or the other. Anyway, and governmental jurisdictions with populations of less than 50,000 people. So there you go. Because this, so that's what they're saying small entities are. Because this proposed rule affects different populations in different ways, the analysis for IRFA has been broken up by provision. Certain provisions may have a significant impact on certain small entities, such as non-FFL manufacturers of firearms parts kits with incomplete firearms frames and receivers. Based on the information from this analysis, ATF estimates that this proposed rule could potentially affect 132,023 entities, including all FFLs and non-FFL manufacturers and retails of firearm parts kits with incomplete firearms frames and receivers, but anticipates that the majority of the entities affected by this rule would experience minimal or no additional costs. Non-FFL manufacturers are anticipated to be small and would potentially have a significant impact on their individual revenue. So non-FFL manufacturers are anticipated to be small and would potentially have a significant impact on their individual revenue. So that's nice sentence for the government to say. The second largest impact would be $12,828 if a manufacturer had to retool their existing production equipment. But ATF anticipates this is unlikely because this proposed rule encompasses the majority of existing technology. This would not affect future production because this work would be part of the normal operations in creating new firearms. ATF estimates the majority of affected entities are small entities that would experience a range of costs. Therefore, this rule may have a significant impact on small entities. So they're like, well, if we step on the ants, let's double check what's going to happen. Oh yeah, we're going to smash the ants. So this rule is going to smash the ants. Thank you. Somebody got paid to write that paragraph right there. Under the RFA, we are required to consider what? That wasn't a comment, by the way. That was not in there, but I was just taking a break. Under the RFA, we are required to consider what, if any, impact this rule would have on small entities. Agencies must perform a review to determine what a rule will have on an impact. Because it has determined that it will, the agency has prepared an initial regulatory flexibility analysis as described by the RFA. The RFA regulatory flexibility analysis must provide or address a description of the reasons why action by the agency is being considered. Did they do that? A succinct statement of the objectives and a legal basis for the proposed rule. A description of and where feasible, an estimate of the number of small entities to which the proposed rule would apply. A description of the projected reporting, record keeping, and other compliance requirements of the proposed rule, including an estimate of the classes of small entities which would be subject to the requirement and the type of professional skills necessary for preparation of the record or report. An identification to extent practicable of all relevant federal rules which may duplicate, overlap, or conflict with the proposed rule, and descriptions of any significant alternatives to the proposed rule which accomplish the stated objectives and applicable statutes which minimize any significant economic impact of the proposed rule on small entities. All right, so they're giving us all the stuff that they have to worry about. And then they will say a description of the reasons why action by the agency is being considered. So now they're going to go through each of those things. So the reason why they're doing this, one of the reasons ATF is considering this proposed regulation is the failure of the market to compensate for negative externalities. I don't know what that word is. It's caused by commercial activities. A negative externality can be the byproduct of a transaction between two parties that is not accounted for in the transaction. 1 + 1 = 3. That's what that just said. This proposed rule would update the existing definition of frame or receiver to account for the majority of technological advances in the industry and ensure that these firearms continue to remain under the regulatory regime as intended by the enactment of the Gun Control Act, including accounting for manufacturing of firearms using multiple manufacturers. In light of recent court cases, the majority of regulated firearms may not meet the existing definition of firearms frame or receiver. This may result in no part of a firearm being regulated as a frame or receiver, contrary to the requirements of the Gun Control Act that ensure tracing to solve crime and help prevent prohibited persons from coming into possession of weapons. Furthermore, finding information in support of criminal cases may be hindered because records are destroyed after 20 years, despite the fact that firearms may last longer than 20 years and be used in criminal activities. This proposed rule would also account for advances in technology performing transactions such as electronic storage. For more specific details regarding the need for regulation, please refer to the specific chapters pertaining to each provision of this proposed rule. That's a pretty interesting part there. I would, if you're listening to this, make a note or something what time this is. That one is pretty important because that's really why they're doing this, and there's some effed up shit in there. All right, I'm not going to comment. I'll keep going. A succinct statement of the objectives and legal bias for the proposed rule. So this is why they're doing it, and this is why they think they have the right to do it. The Attorney General is responsible for enforcing the Gun Control Act as amended and the NFA as amended. This responsibility includes the authority to promulgate regulations necessary to enforce the provisions of the Gun Control Act and the National Firearms Act. Congress and the Attorney General have delegated the responsibility for administering the enforcement of the gun control and the NFA to the Director of the ATF, subject to the direction of the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General. Accordingly, the Department and the ATF have promulgated regulations implementing both the Gun Control Act and the NFA. So they're suggesting that because Congress has given the Attorney General the right to administer the law, that they been given the right to administer and enforce the Gun Control Act and the NFA, that they also have the right to implement these changes. The proposed rule provides new regulatory definitions of firearm, frame, or receiver, and frame or receiver because they are outdated. The proposed rule would also amend ATF's definition of firearms and gunsmith to clarify the meaning of those terms and to add new regulatory terms such as complete weapon, complete muffler or silencer device, privately made firearm, and readily for purposes of clarity, given advancements in firearms technology. Further, the proposed rule would amend ATF's regulations on marking, record keeping that are necessary to implement these new definitions. They've said that a million times. I think there's, well, I'm not commenting. A description of, and where feasible, an estimate of the number of small entities to which a proposed rule will apply. ATF estimates that this rule could potentially affect 132,023 entities, including all FFLs, non-FFL manufacturers, and retailers of firearms kits, but anticipates the majority of the entities affected by this rule would experience no or minimal additional costs. ATF anticipates the majority of affected entities are small entities and would experience any range of costs. Therefore, this rule would have a significant impact on a substantial number of small entities. So that sounds like it's stepping on a lot of people. An identification to the extent practicable of all relevant federal rules which may duplicate, overlap, or conflict with the proposed rule. This proposed rule does not duplicate or conflict with other federal rules. Nice, that's their one sentence response to that. Next one is descriptions of any significant alterations to the proposed rule which accomplish the stated objectives of applicable statutes which may minimize any significant economic impact of the proposed rule on small entities. That's a government sentence. The significant alternatives considered are set forth of this preamble. For more details, oh my goodness. Okay, descriptions of any significant alternatives to the proposal which accomplish the same goals, which minimize any significant impact on small entities. So they just suggested that small entities are going to be the one who are the majority of the one affected, and therefore it's going to have a significant impact on small entities. And then they come over here and say, how do you justify how do you where do you go? How do you descriptions of any significant alternatives to the rule which don't impact small entities. So, they admit that it smashes small entities and that they're the most affected. And when they say, well, what are your alternatives? What are the significant alternatives? They go, they're considered and set forth in the preamble. For more details, go F yourself. So isn't that nice? They just leave one sentence for the parts that are supposed to be the checks and balances. Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act of 1996. So this proposed rule is not a major rule as defined by the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act. So they're saying that this is not a major change. It's not a major ruling. It's not a major rule. So they're going to change the definition of firearms, and that is not a major change. Unfunded Mandate Reform Act of 1995. This proposed rule will not result in the expenditure by state, local, and tribal governments in the aggregate or by the private sector of $100 million or more in any 1 year, and it will not significantly or uniquely affect small governments. Therefore, no actions were deemed necessary under the provisions of the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 1995. So I guess in 1995, they did something that stopped dumbasses from spending $100 million. They're saying it's not going to cost $100 million. So we got the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1995. This proposed rule would call for collections of information under the Paperwork Reduction Act. As defined, collection of information comprises reporting, record keeping, monitoring, posting, labeling, and other similar actions. The title and description of the information collected, a description of those who must collect the information, and an estimate of the total annual burden to follow. The estimates cover for the time for reviewing instructions, searching existing sources of the data, gathering and maintaining the data, and completing reviewing the collection. Under the provisions of the proposed rule, there would be a one-time increase in paperwork burdens of identification markings placed on firearms as well as additional transaction records. This requirement would be added to the existing approved collection covered by this other thing. So they're saying there would be a one-time increase in paperwork burden, changing the definition of firearms, serializing AR uppers, one-time increase in paperwork burden. That's not an unrealistic interpretation of what's supposed to be stopping you, preventing you from putting unnecessary or unfair laws through. They're not lawmakers, they're representatives. And the people in this branch are not. They are people who are brought in with those Senate hearings and then just hired. That's why we don't let them make laws, right? I'm not commenting though. OMB 1140-0050, because everybody knows what that means. Proposed use of information. The BATF would use this information in fighting crime by facilitating the tracing of firearms used in criminal activities. The systematic tracking of firearms from the manufacturer or U.S. importer to the retail purchaser also enables law enforcement agencies to identify suspects involved in criminal violations, determine if a firearm is stolen, and provide other information relevant to criminal investigation. If you are a content creator, I highly encourage you to challenge all of this because this is what it is based on and it is not correct. Currently, there are 12,252 licensed manufacturers of firearms and 1,342 licensed importers. Of the potential number of licensed dealers and licensed pawnbrokers, ATF estimates that those directly affected would be a one-time surge of 5,268 licensed dealers, 710 licensed pawnbrokers, and 36 non-licensed dealers that would be affected. This proposed rule would affect a one-time surge of 6,444 respondents. Okay. Frequency of response. There will be a recurring response for all currently existing 13,595 licensed manufacturers and licensed importers. This proposed rule would affect a one-time number of responses, 12,000 responses. So they're suggesting that changing the definition of firearms would require, what, 12,000 pieces of paper right here? One time. All you got to do is, oh yeah, all of our guns have 2 serial numbers. Let me get one piece of paper to deal with that. Burden of response. This includes recurring time burden of 1 minute. ATF anticipates a one-time hourly burden of 0.25 hours per respondent. All right, so it's going to take the ATF 1 minute to deal with each of these things. There you go. Estimate of total annual burden. The current burden listed in this collection of information is 85,630 hours. The new burden as a result of the proposed rulemaking is a one-time hourly burden of just 3,000 hours. Come on, it's just 3,000 hours, no big deal. Licensed firearms, I don't know what this is, something proposed use of information. The BATFE would use this information for criminal investigation or regulatory compliance with the Gun Control Act of 1968. The Attorney General may inspect or examine the inventory records of a licensed importer, manufacturer, dealer, without such reasonable cause or warrant, and during the course of a criminal investigation of a person or persons other than the licensee in order to ensure compliance with record-keeping requirements. The Attorney General may also inspect or examine any records relating to the firearms involved in a criminal investigation that is traced to the licensee or firearms that may have been disposed of during the course of a bona fide criminal investigation. Description and number of respondents. The current number of respondents is 9,056 firearms manufacturers, but this proposed rule would have a one-time surge for an unknown select few licensed manufacturers. These are, I think they're supposed to be anticipating how much consequence there is of this law. I don't think. This includes a one-time 1 minute burden. The burden resulting from this proposed rule is 0.25 hours set in a set of submittals by the licensed dealers and licensed pawnbrokers to licensed manufacturers. You want to push over whoever wrote that. What the hell? Push them off their chair. The current burden listed in this collection of information is 205 hours. The new burden as a result of this proposed rulemaking is 1,000. Sure. Yeah, look, that number went down. Government's winning. As a result, the Paperwork Reduction Act, a copy of this proposed rule will be submitted for its review to the collections of information. We ask for public comment on the proposed collection of information to help us determine how useful the information is, whether it can help us perform our functions better, whether it is readily available elsewhere, how accurate our estimate of the burden of collection is, how valid our methods of determining burden are, how we can improve the quality, usefulness, and clarity of the information, how we can minimize burden of collection. I got a drink. This is horrible. You need not respond to a collection of information unless it displays a currently valid control number for OMB. Before the requirements for this collection of information becomes effective, we will publish a notice in the Federal Register and request additional comments regarding the collection of information prior to the OMB's decision to modify or to approve proposed collection. Whew. Now we get to this part, I think. Public participation, comments sought. ATF requests comments on the proposed rule from all interested persons. That might be you. ATF specifically requests comments on the feasibility of implementing the new definition of firearm frame or receiver, related definitions and amendments that ensure the proper marking, record keeping, and traceability of all firearms manufactured, acquired, and disposed of by FFLs. ATF also requests comments on the cost benefits of the proposed rule and on the appropriate methodology and data for collecting those costs and benefits. All comments must reference this document's docket number, ATF 2021 R-05, be legible, and include the commenter's complete first and last name and full mailing address. ATF may not consider or respond to comments that do not meet these requirements or comments containing profanity. ATF will retain all comments as part of this rulemaking's administrative record. ATF will treat all comments as originals and will not acknowledge receipt of comments. In addition, if ATF cannot read your comment due to technical difficulties and cannot contact you for clarification, ATF may not be able to consider your comment. ATF will carefully consider all comments as appropriate received on or before the closing date and will give comments after that date the same consideration if practical to do so, but assurance of consideration cannot be given as to comments received on or before the closing date. Confidentiality. ATF will make all comments meeting the requirements of this section, whether submitted electronically or on paper, available for public viewing at ATF and on the internet through the federal e-making portal and subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Commenters who do not want their name or other personal identifying information posted on the internet should submit comments by mail or facsimile, along with a separate cover sheet containing their personal information. Both the cover sheet and the comment must reference this docket number. For comments submitted by mail or fax, information contained on the cover sheet will not appear when posted on the internet, but any personal identifying information that appears within the comment will not be redacted by ATF and it will appear on the internet. A commenter may submit to the ATF information identified as a proprietary or confidential business information. The commenter shall place any portion of a comment that is proprietary or confidential business information under law on pages separate from the balance of the comment, with each page prominently marked proprietary or confidential business information at the top of the page. ATF will not make proprietary or confidential business information submitted in compliance with these instructions available when disclosing the comments that it receives. It will disclose that the commenter provided proprietary or confidential information that the ATF is holding in a separate file to which the public does not have access. If ATF receives a request to examine or copy this information, it will treat it as if any other request under the Freedom of Information Act. In addition, ATF will disclose such proprietary or confidential business information to the extent required by other legal processes. Submitting comments. Submit comments in any of three ways, but do not submit the same comment multiple times or by more than one method. Hand-delivered comments will not be accepted. Through the rulemaking portal, ATF recommends that you submit your comments via the ATF Federal Rulemaking Portal at regulations.gov and follow the instructions. Comments will be posted within a few days of being submitted. However, large volumes of comments are being processed simultaneously. Your comment may not be viewable for up to several weeks. Please keep the comment tracking number that is provided after you successfully uploaded your comment. Send written comments to the address listed in the addresses section of this document. Written comments must appear in minimum 12-point font size, include the commenter's first and last name and mailing address, be signed, and may be of any length. Submit comments by fax transmission to 202-648-9741. Fax comments must include 12-point font size, be legible and clear, 8.5 by 11 paper, signed and contain the commenter's complete first and last name and full mailing address, be no more than 5 pages long. Request for a hearing. Any interested person who desires an opportunity to comment orally at the public hearing should request his or her request in writing to the director of ATF, which there is none, within the 90-day comment period. The director, which we don't have one, however, reserves the right to determine, in light of all circumstances, whether a public hearing is necessary. Oh, I thought that was a public hearing. Disclosure. Copies of this proposed rule and comments received in response to it will be available through the federal rulemaking portal, regulations.gov. search for ATF 2021 R-05, and for public inspection at the appointment during normal business hours, the ATF reading room, room 1E-063, 99 New York Avenue, Northeast, Washington, D.C. 20226. Telephone number 202-648-8740. List of subjects. Administrative practice and what is this? This is just a list of words. I'm not reading that. Authority and issuance. I'm not reading that. Authority. I think it's getting weird. It's getting weird. And it's getting dumb and weird. Are we done? Are we done? Now it's definitions. Now it's pictures. I'm going to scroll back out. I don't know if we're done reading it or what's going on here. So this was a portion of it, and then it just keep going. So then it says submitting comments. We read all that. Copies of this proposed rule will be, I already said that one, I think. List of subjects. This is just a bunch of words. Look at the government just put keywords in here, and they did it 3 times. So they did it wrong. They didn't even do keywords right. Authority and issuance, and then part 447, importation of arms, ammunition, and implements of war. See, there's a bunch of weirdness. I'm not reading all that. Just a bunch of subsections and blah, blah, blah. And then you get meaning of terms. So subsection 478-11. I think this is just all the footnoting. So it's about half guts and half footnoting. And if you're scrolling up and down in it, the footnoting is where the pictures are. So it's trying to use the best pictures I've ever seen in 2021. I mean, it is 20,021, and you know, the government is trying to use the internet and whatever, and like, these are the best pictures they came up with. These are amazing pictures. These look like a Xerox of a photocopy of fax. Hell. So this is their garbage. What is this? This is the same picture. Corporate would like you to tell the difference between these 2 pictures. Example 4. Semi-automatic firearm machine gun with a single receiver housing all fire control components. The frame receiver is part of the firearm that provides the AK type. There's no difference at all. There's 3 pins and there's 3 pins. Ugh. This should make you want to get mad that somebody got paid to put that picture twice on a government thing and they didn't get fired or anything. This says frame, and then this also says frame, but there's no line to it, so I don't know what it, and I don't know if frame means that hole right there. I don't know if that's the takedown. Frame chassis. I'm just looking at a bunch of dumb pictures of idiots trying to label things. This isn't even a, this is a skewed picture. Shouldn't they have to have it actually right? I'm just not commenting. I think we're done. That was it. So I don't know. What did that take? A minute? Half minute? A couple of minutes? 2 hours and 30 minutes? Wow. To read this thing. It was pretty good reading. You're probably going to want to turn that on for the babies and youngins so they go to sleep and learn about government good and how safe the ATF is for us and how much they care about our property and our feelings and whatnot. So I'm not commenting. That's the end. At this point, nobody's listening to us anymore. Oh, man. Air Guns is out there. Echo was out there earlier. Good dude. Florida. Reloader. He's doing stuff. Chick was out there earlier. Hunt was out there earlier. Does chats. Sundays, other days. Ghost is out there. Does chats yesterdays. Or no, wait. Tuesdays, not yesterdays. And I think that's everybody. Everybody. Kingpin was out there. Doesn't like Walt. Is that everybody? Yeah, I think this whole thing was a giant run-on sentence. All right, well, thanks everybody for showing up. You're crazy. If you listen to this whole thing, you're more 2A than almost everybody. If you listen to this whole thing or if you read along, you can go outside and push somebody over because you're more 2A than them and they can't do nothing about it because they're not 2A. All right, man, Echo wins. Enrique's also good. And we'll be back to pick you up later. Don't let infringements happen. Whatever. There's a better way to say that, but that's pretty much the gist of it.